I am going to tell you a story. The Hobbit Who Slept Beneath the Old Oak.
Claude Opus 4-6 thinking The Hobbit Who Slept Beneath the Old Oak, a fantasy sleep story for deep rest. Tonight, dear traveler, you are invited to walk slowly into a quieter world, a world of soft hills and lantern light, a world of mossy paths, old trees, distant bells, and warm windows glowing against the evening, a world where no one is in a hurry, where even the wind seems to move more gently, where the oldest things still remember how to keep the night kind. So let your breathing soften, let your shoulders grow heavy, let the day drift a little farther away, like a leaf set upon a stream, turning slowly, growing smaller, carried gently toward the place where all days come to rest. There is no need to hold anything tightly tonight. No thought requires your attention. No question waits for your answer. The hours ahead belong to quietness, and quietness asks nothing of you at all. And if you wish, imagine that you are walking now through a peaceful green valley under a sky turning gold and blue, following a small traveler named Elwyn, a humble hobbit with round cheeks, tired feet, a patched brown coat, and a heart that always longed for home, warmth, and rest. He is walking slowly ahead of you along a gentle road. His footsteps are soft upon the earth. His shadow stretches long behind him in the golden light of the sinking sun. He does not look back, but somehow you feel that he knows you are there, and that your company brings him comfort, as his brings comfort to you. And this is the story of the night he slept beneath the old oak. Come, walk with him now. There is no need to hurry. The valley will wait for you. The road is kind, and the old oak, patient as it has always been, is already there, standing tall and quiet in a grove beyond the stream, keeping its ancient shelter warm and ready for those who need it most. Part 1. The Gentle Road Through the Valley. There was, in the western folds of an old and peaceful land, a valley so quiet that even the clouds seemed to pass above it with great care. It lay between hills that rolled like the breathing of some vast sleeping creature, their green flanks rising and falling in long, unhurried lines against the sky. No sharp peaks troubled the horizon there, or no cliffs or crags interrupted the softness of the land. Everything curved gently, the hills, the lanes, the hedgerows, the slow bends of the streams, as though the earth itself had chosen long ago to shape this place for comfort. The hills were covered in soft grass that bent in silver waves beneath the wind. In some places, the grass was short and fine, cropped by sheep into smooth green carpets that shone in the sunlight. In other places, it grew tall and feathery, swaying in slow unison like something half asleep, brushing against the legs of anyone who wandered through it. Wildflowers grew among the grass, clover in pink and white, buttercups catching the light like tiny cups of gold, ox-eye daisies standing pale and steady along the verges, and here and there a spray of forget-me-nots, blue as fragments of fallen sky. The streams wound slowly through the meadows like ribbons of glass, turning here and there between reeds, stones, and willow roots. And they were not large streams, not the kind that roar and rush between boulders, but quiet, conversational little waters that murmured over pebbles and pooled in shaded places beneath overhanging banks. Kingfishers sometimes flashed along them, brief darts of blue and copper. Minnows turned in the shallow places, catching the light, and the willows that lined their banks trailed their long fingers in the current as though testing the temperature of the day. Little hedges divided the fields. Old stone walls, half sunk with time and softened by moss, marked the borders of forgotten gardens and ancient lanes. Some of these walls were so old that no one in the valley could say who had built them or why. They simply were not part of the landscape, part of the long memory of the land, as natural as the stones in the stream beds. Ivy and wild rose climbed over them. Small birds nested in their crevices. Lizards basked upon their sun-warmed tops on summer afternoons, in still as little gray statues, dreaming whatever quiet dreams lizards dream. At dawn, mist lay in the low places like white wool, filling the hollows and valleys with soft cloud, so that the hilltops rose above it like green islands in a milk-white sea. The mist would thin slowly as the morning advanced, drawing apart in long threads, catching the early sunlight, until it shone briefly with gold and silver before vanishing entirely, so leaving behind only the faintest dampness on the grass and a freshness in the air that tasted of dew and young leaves. At noon, bees wandered among clover and thyme, moving from flower to flower with the focused contentment of creatures who know exactly what they are meant to be doing. Their hum was part of the valley's music, a low, warm sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising and falling with the passing of clouds and the slow turning of the sun. Butterflies drifted through the warm air. Hawks circled high and silent overhead. The whole land seemed to breathe in golden light. And in the evening, the evening was the finest hour. In the evening, the valley glowed with that deep, quiet light that comes only just before sunset, when the world seems to exhale. The western sky would turn to amber, then to rose, then to a color that had no proper name, something between copper and lavender, warm and tender, as though the sky were blushing at its own beauty. The fields would darken to a richer green. Every hedge, every wall, every tree stood outlined in that gentle radiance, each detail softened and deepened, as though the whole valley were being painted in light mixed with honey. It was through this valley, in this very hour of golden evening, that Elwyn Bramblefoot was walking. Elwyn was not a grand traveler. He did not seek glory. He did not chase danger. I had no map marked with dragons, no heroic errand, no shining sword, no tales of conquest to carry from inn to inn. He was, in truth, the kind of traveler that the great ballads tend to overlook. A small, round, soft-footed fellow, of no particular importance to anyone save himself, his few good friends, and the cat who waited at his kitchen door each morning with an expression of patient expectation. What Elwyn carried instead of grand ambitions was a satchel of simple things, a folded blanket, wool somewhat faded, with a pattern of green and brown stripes that had once been quite handsome and was now merely very comfortable. A heel of bread, dense, dark bread of the kind baked slowly in a stone oven, with a thick crust and a soft, slightly sweet interior. A little round of cheese wrapped in cloth. Pale, crumbly, good cheese, the kind made by someone who talked gently to their goats. An apple, small, red, slightly lopsided, and polished on his sleeve until it shone. A small brass spoon, a family piece, nothing valuable, but Elwyn had carried it on every journey since his uncle had given it to him years ago, and he would not have parted with it for silver. A teacup with a chip in the rim, cream-colored, with a painted sprig of forget-me-nots on the side, the chip on the rim so familiar to his lip that a perfect cup would have felt wrong. And, tucked very carefully into a side pocket, a tiny packet of dried mint leaves for tea, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. These to Elwyn were treasures enough, for Elwyn understood something that many larger, louder, busier folk often miss, that comfort lies not in the grandness of one's possessions, but in the familiarity and kindness of them. A cup that knows your hand, a blanket that knows your shape, a spoon that has stirred 100 pots of soup. These things carry a warmth that gold cannot buy, and Elwyn valued them accordingly. He was a hobbit of modest habits and soft preferences. He liked porridge on cold mornings, made thick and smooth with a swirl of cream and a spoonful of dark honey. He liked soup on rainy evenings, leek and potato, perhaps, or parsnip and thyme, simmered for hours until the flavors grew deep and gentle. He liked polished wood, the grain brought out by years of care and beeswax. He liked warm doors that opened without sticking. He liked shelves of crockery arranged just so, the blue bowl beside the green, the tall jug behind the short, everything in its proper and peaceful place. He liked thick curtains drawn against the dark, shutting out the wind and the wild night, and creating within his little house a circle of lamplight and warmth where nothing could trouble him. He liked the sound of someone stirring a pot in the next room, not because the pot itself was important, but because it meant that someone was near, that care was being taken, that goodness was being prepared. He liked hearth rugs, thick and slightly worn, their patterns softened by firelight. He liked seed cake, dense, buttery, flecked with caraway seeds, best eaten with afternoon tea and a shaft of sunlight from the garden window. He liked low songs, the kind hummed rather than sung, melodies without hurry, tunes that wandered like paths through a wood and found their way home again without ever seeming to try. And he liked chairs that knew exactly how to support a sleepy back, chairs with arms at the right height for resting elbows, seats that had learned the shape of the sitter over years of comfortable use, backs that curved just enough to suggest that leaning into them was not merely permitted, but encouraged. And, above all, Elwyn liked to be home before nightfall, which made the present situation slightly unfortunate. For though the valley was beautiful, and though the weather had been mild, and though the walk had offered many pleasant sights throughout the day, a hawk circling high over the western ridge, its wings tipped with gold in the afternoon light, a cart full of onions passing along a distant lane, pulled by a gray donkey who seemed in no hurry whatsoever, a fox slipping like amber through the tall grass near a hedgerow, would pausing to glance at Elwyn with bright, unhurried eyes before continuing on some vulpine errand of its own, a patch of wild strawberries growing beside a stone wall, so ripe and small and sweet that Elwyn had eaten a handful standing there in the lane, with juice on his chin and a smile on his face. The day had grown longer than he had intended. He had lingered too long at a farmhouse gate, admiring a garden of sweet peas and hollyhocks. He had paused too often to watch the light change upon the hills. He had taken the longer path around a meadow rather than crossing through it, because the longer path followed the stream, and the stream was pleasant company. He had stopped once to help a farmer lift a fallen branch from a lane, and the farmer had thanked him with a cup of cider and a long, slow conversation about the weather, which is never a short subject in a valley where weather is considered an art. And now evening was drawing near. Elwyn paused at the crest of a hill and looked down. The light was turning. That unmistakable change was moving through the valley. The shift from day's gold to evening's amber, the deepening of shadows, the softening of every color, as though the world were being gently wrapped in gauze. The far meadows had become softer in hue, their vivid greens mellowing to the color of sage and old copper. The stream below caught the last of the direct sunlight and held it in bright, broken lines that shifted and swayed over its surface like silver thread unwinding. The shadows of hedgerows stretched longer over the ground, blue-gray and cool. The air had changed too. It was cooler now, carrying the faint sweetness of evening flowers beginning to open, of dew beginning to gather on grass, of the earth itself exhaling the warmth it had gathered through the long hours of sun. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang once, then again. A village bell, steady, old, bronze-voiced, calling out from a tower too far away to see. Its sound carried across the valley with that particular clarity that evening gives to distant sounds, as though the air growing stiller were holding each note carefully and passing it along from field to hill to stream. But the village was too far to reach before full dark. Elwyn could see that plainly. The bell was a comfort, and not a summons. It told him that the world was orderly and kind, that somewhere people were closing shutters and lighting lamps and setting kettles on the fire. But it could not bring those comforts any closer to his tired feet. Elwyn sighed, not a troubled sigh, not a sigh of despair or frustration, only the sort of sigh one gives when realizing that supper may be later than expected, and that the comfortable chair one had imagined will have to wait, and that the evening ahead may be rather more adventurous than one would have chosen, if indeed one were in the habit of choosing adventure, which Elwyn most certainly was not. "Well," he said quietly to himself, in the patient, practical tone of one who has learned to accept the road's small inconveniences without complaint, "I suppose the road has made its own plans today." He adjusted the strap of his satchel, which had been slowly working its way into the crease between his shoulder and his neck, in the manner that satchel straps have been doing since satchels were first invented. He settled it into a more comfortable position, took a breath of the cooling air, and continued onward. The path curved gently down between wild grasses and pale thistle blooms. The thistles were beautiful in their own way, their purple heads like tiny crowns of silk, their stems silver gray in the fading light. Elwyn had always liked thistles, though he would not have wanted them in his garden. They were wild things, road things, belonging to hedgerows and hillsides, and they wore the evening light well. The air smelled of warm earth, crushed herbs, and distant water. Each breath brought new layers of scent. The dry, sweet smell of grass, cut earlier in the day somewhere nearby. The faint herbaceous tang of wild thyme growing between stones. The cool green smell of water moving through reeds. And beneath all of these, deep and unchanging, the rich, dark smell of the earth itself, the oldest smell in the world, the smell that lies beneath all gardens and all roads and all the places where things grow and rest and grow again. Swallows skimmed low over the fields, gathering themselves before night. They moved in long, sweeping arcs, their wings slicing the air with a grace that seemed effortless, though it was surely the product of a lifetime of practice. They called to one another in high, thin voices, quick, bright sounds that seemed to stitch the evening together, connecting sky to field to hedge in lines of swift, darting flight. Soon they would be gone, retreating to their roosts beneath eaves and barn rafters, and the sky would belong to the bats and the stars. Near a stone wall, a pair of rabbits sat upright in the grass and watched Elwyn with grave attention. Their ears were tall and alert, and their eyes were round and dark and full of that particular stillness that rabbits possess. The stillness of creatures who know that the world is large and they are small, and who have made their peace with this arrangement by becoming very, very good at being still. They watched Elwyn approach with an air of mild curiosity, as though he were a moderately interesting but ultimately harmless event in an otherwise predictable evening. Then, as he drew near, and they vanished into a tangle of roots beneath the wall, their white tails flashing once like tiny lamps before the green swallowed them up. Elwyn smiled at them. He was tired, but not unhappy. There was something comforting in a long road when the weather was kind and the world had not yet become dark. The tiredness in his legs was not the sharp, complaining sort, but rather a deep, warm ache that spoke of honest walking and good ground covered. His feet, though sore, they still carried him willingly. His back, though stiff from the weight of his satchel, straightened when he took a deep breath. And his heart, though it missed his little house and his own warm chair, was not troubled. For Elwyn trusted, as many small and gentle souls do, that somewhere ahead there would be a place prepared for him. A little inn, perhaps, with a fire in the grate and a room under the eaves where the mattress was thick and the window looked out upon the sleeping fields. A cottage with lamplight in the window, where a kind stranger might offer a chair by the hearth and a bowl of broth. A barn loft full of sweet hay, where the sounds of animals shifting below would be as comforting as any lullaby. A shepherd's hut on the hillside with a rough blanket and a candle stub and a view of stars through the open door. Even a sheltered tree, if it came to that, a wide tree with generous roots and dry ground beneath, where one could wrap oneself in a blanket and listen to the night and sleep well enough. So he walked. He walked through the last of the sun-warmed fields, where the light lay in long golden bands across the grass, and the air was still warm against his skin. He crossed a narrow wooden stile polished smooth by years of passing boots, the wood worn to a soft silver gray, the grain raised by weather, the step hollowed just slightly in the middle where countless feet had rested. He placed his hand upon the top rail and felt the smoothness of it, the warmth still lingering in the wood from the day's sun. And for a moment he stood there on the stile, one foot on either side, looking out over the valley as it settled into evening. He followed a lane edged with blackberry brambles and elderflower shrubs. The blackberries were not yet ripe, small, hard, green nubs among the thorns, but the elderflower was in full bloom, its flat white heads perfuming the evening air with a scent that was part honey, part cream, part something older and greener that had no name, but belonged entirely to this season and this hour. He listened to the valley settling into evening. There is a moment, just before dusk, when the world begins to change its voice. It happens gradually, like the turning of a page in a very long book. One sound softens, another rises. The pitch of the air itself seems to shift, in dropping lower, growing more resonant, as though the land were tuning itself to a different key, the key of night, which is deeper and more spacious than the key of day. The bright chatter of daytime grows quieter. The birds that have been singing all afternoon begin to fall silent, one by one. as though each has reached the end of its song and cannot quite remember how to begin another. Their calls become more occasional, single notes offered into the stillness, answered sometimes, sometimes not. Birdsong becomes more occasional, and each note seems larger for the silence around it, like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending out rings of quiet. The insects begin. The crickets, who have been waiting all day with the patience of very small musicians, take up their thin, continuous song. It is not a melody exactly, more a texture, a shimmer of sound, a silver thread woven through the darkening air. It begins so softly that one hardly notices it at first. And then it is everywhere, surrounding everything, a gentle, endless murmur that seems to come from the grass itself, from the stones, from the very earth. The breeze cools, the warm gusts of afternoon settle into something steadier and more gentle, a breath of air that carries the coolness of water and shadow, of places where the sun has already departed, of the night gathering itself in the eastern hollows. Water sounds clearer. The streams, which during the day are only one voice among many, begin to stand out as the other sounds recede. Their murmur becomes more distinct, more musical, each ripple and eddy suddenly audible in a way that the busier hours had obscured. And all across the land, unseen creatures begin the ancient, patient business of night. Hedgehogs stir beneath their hedges. Owls open their great round eyes in the hollows of trees. Foxes stretch and yawn in their dens. Moths begin their first tentative flights, drawn toward the scent of night-blooming flowers. Bats flicker out from beneath roof tiles and barn beams, their wings making small, papery sounds against the darkening air. And in the ponds and ditches, frogs begin to call, low, rhythmic, persistent, the very voice of evening water. Elwyn heard that moment arrive around him. He heard a blackbird sing once from a hawthorn hedge, a single, liquid phrase, rich and full, poured into the evening air like dark honey. He heard the dry hush of grass bending in the wind, a sound so soft that it was almost more a feeling than a sound, the whisper of a million slender blades leaning together and apart, in slow, continuous motion. He heard the small, clicking song of crickets begin among the stones, first one, then another, then so many that they became a single gentle chorus, ceaseless and comforting. And somewhere, from lower down in the valley, he heard the sound of a stream moving over pebbles, a sound that is perhaps the most ancient lullaby in the world, older than any song, older than any words, the patient voice of water finding its way through the darkness of the land. That, Elwyn decided, was reason enough to pause. He followed the sound. The path led him downhill through a stand of young birch trees, their white trunks pale in the fading light, their leaves trembling even in the gentlest movement of air. The grass here was longer and cooler, dampened already by the first touch of dew. Elwyn's feet moved through it with a soft, swishing sound like a hand drawn slowly through silk. The sound of the stream grew closer. He could distinguish its different voices now, the higher, brighter sound of water tumbling over a stone ledge, the deeper murmur of a slower current moving through a deeper channel, and the gentle lapping where the water met the banks and turned back upon itself in small, quiet eddies. Then the path brought him to a little bridge, a very old bridge made of low stone and covered in patches of pale green moss. It was not a grand bridge, no arches, no carved railings. no statues of kings or guardian figures. It was simply two low stone walls, each about knee-height, spanning a gap of perhaps 20 feet across the stream. The stones were rounded and worn, fitted together without mortar, and held in place by their own weight and by the slow patience of centuries. Moss grew thick upon them, soft, bright green moss that was damp to the touch and smelled of rain and shade. Small ferns had taken root in the crevices between the stones, their fronds uncurling delicately into the evening air. Beneath the bridge ran a clear stream, no wider than two outstretched walking sticks, but lively enough to catch the fading light in silver pieces. The water was dark and bright at once, dark where it pooled, bright where it broke over stones. It ran in gentle curves beneath the bridge, its surface catching the last reflections of the sky and turning them into moving patterns of gold and gray and deepening blue. Elwyn sat on the bridge wall. He took off his hat, a worn, comfortable hat, broad-brimmed, slightly battered, the color of old leaves, and set it beside him on the stone. He loosened his collar, which had been pressing against his neck for the last mile in a way that collars do when one has been walking longer than expected. He dipped his fingers in the stream and sighed again, this time with approval. The water was cold and clean. It ran over his fingers with a gentle pressure, cool and constant, carrying with it the faintest tingling sensation, as though the coldness were not merely temperature but energy, the quiet, tireless energy of water that has been moving through shade and stone and fern shadow for longer than memory. A perfect sort of water, the kind that seems to come from somewhere ancient and fern-shadowed, from deep places between mossy rocks, where the light never fully reaches, but is never entirely absent, where the air is always cool, and the silence is always green. Elwyn dried his fingers on his coat, which was already somewhat damp from the evening dew, and therefore made very little difference one way or the other. He took out his apple and ate it slowly, looking at the valley. The apple was crisp and sweet, with a faint tartness just beneath the skin that balanced the sweetness and made each bite more satisfying than the last. He ate it in small, thoughtful bites, turning it in his hand, watching the valley as he chewed. The juice ran over his chin once, and he wiped it with the back of his hand without the slightest embarrassment. For there was no one to see, and the evening did not care for manners. Above the stream, reeds moved in long, soft lines, their feathery tops swaying in unison like a slow, silent dance. They were tall and elegant, their stems green gold in the last light, their seed heads catching the breeze and bending, recovering, bending again, with the patient repetition of things that have been moving in exactly this way since long before anyone thought to watch them. Dragonflies hovered over the darker pools, their wings catching the light in brief iridescent flashes, blue, green, violet, before darting away to hover over some other spot, then darting back again. Their movements were quick, but not urgent, purposeful, but not frantic. They seemed entirely at ease with the evening, entirely absorbed in the business of being dragonflies. A hedgehog rustled in the underbrush nearby with the deep seriousness of a creature entirely occupied by its own evening affairs. Elwyn heard it snuffling among the leaves, turning things over with its nose, making small, decisive sounds that suggested it knew exactly what it was looking for and was quite confident of finding it. He did not see it, hedgehogs being excellent at remaining unseen when they choose. But its presence was comforting in the way that all small, busy, harmless creatures are comforting. It was a sound that said, "All is well. The evening is proceeding as expected. There is food to be found, and shelter to be reached, and nothing whatsoever to worry about." For a while Elwyn simply sat. He watched the light dim. The process was so gradual, so gentle, that it was almost impossible to see it happening. One moment, the valley was pale gold. Then, without any visible change, it was amber. Then, without any further transition, it was the color of old bronze. The sky above the western hills deepened from blue to violet, and the first star appeared. A single point of light, steady and calm, as though it had been waiting all day for its turn to shine, and was now doing so with quiet satisfaction. He listened to the stream. Its voice seemed to grow richer as the other sounds faded around it. The water spoke in many tones at once. A low murmur here, a higher ripple there, a soft splashing where it ran over a fallen branch, a gentle gurgling where it entered the pool beneath the bridge. Together, these sounds made a kind of music, not a tune, not a harmony in the human sense, but something older and more elemental, a continuous, ever-changing flow of sound that seemed to follow no pattern, and yet was never random, never harsh, never anything but deeply, deeply soothing. He allowed the tiredness in his legs to spread gently upward. It moved like warmth from a fire, slowly, steadily, without any effort on his part. First, his calves relaxed, then his thighs, then his lower back, which had been holding itself stiffly without his knowing it, and now let go with a sensation of relief so profound that Elwyn sighed once more. The tiredness became not discomfort, but heaviness, and then not heaviness, but something softer still, a gentle, pleasant weight that settled into his muscles and his bones, easing them downward, loosening them, inviting them to rest. It was the first invitation of rest, not sleep itself, not yet, but the beginning of the journey toward sleep, the first step along that quiet road that leads from waking through drowsiness into dream. Elwyn felt it arrive and did not resist it. He let it settle over him like a blanket, like the evening itself, like the sound of the stream, like the cooling air. When at last he rose, he felt calmer than before. His body moved more slowly, more gently. His thoughts had softened at their edges like stones smoothed by water. The sharp, busy thoughts of the day, where to go, how far to walk, when to stop, what to eat, had faded into the background, replaced by something quieter and more spacious, a kind of open attention that noticed everything and worried about nothing. But the inn he had hoped to find was nowhere in sight. The stream turned away between alder trees, over their dark trunks leaning over the water like old friends sharing a conversation. The nearest chimney smoke was a thin gray thread against the darkening sky, rising from a farmhouse that must have been a mile or more away, perhaps 2. And though the sky still held light, it was now the light of evening, not day. That soft, uncertain luminance that comes after the sun has set, but before the stars have fully claimed the sky, when the world exists in a kind of gentle suspension between what was and what will be. Then Elwyn noticed something he had not seen before, a narrow path, almost hidden. It began just beyond the bridge, where elder bushes and fern fronds leaned together in a loose green curtain. The entrance was so subtle that one could easily have walked past it a dozen times without seeing it. Indeed, Elwyn felt certain that he had looked in that direction earlier and seen nothing but undergrowth. But now, in this particular light, at this particular angle, with his eyes softened by tiredness and his mind quieted by the stream, he could see it clearly. A way through the green, a footpath so quiet and moss-covered that it seemed less made than remembered. The moss upon it was thick and soft, the deep green of old velvet, unmarked by any recent footprint, but clearly, to an eye that knew how to look, a path none the less. It wound between the elder bushes and the ferns, rising gently uphill toward a grove of trees that stood dark and full against the deepening sky. Elwyn stood very still. The path called to him, not with a voice, not with any sound at all, but with something quieter than sound. A feeling, a pull, the way that a warm door calls to someone standing in the cold, or the way a familiar song calls to someone who has been too long without music. Something about it felt welcoming, not strange, not ominous, not uncanny in any way that would trouble a sensible hobbit, only quiet in a way that called to other quiet things, only inviting in the way that certain very old places are inviting, places that have been there so long that they have worn smooth the boundaries between the ordinary and the extraordinary, yet between the world as it is and the world as it was, between the seen and the almost seen. Elwyn adjusted his satchel once more, took up his walking stick, a good stick, ash wood, smooth with use, and stepped from the bridge onto the hidden path. And almost at once, the valley changed. Part 2, the grove of fern and evening light. The open air of the meadow gave way to the hush of trees. It was a gradual transition, like stepping from one room into another through a curtain of green silk. First, the elder bushes rose on either side, their branches thick with creamy flower clusters that scented the air with honeyed sweetness. Then the ferns grew taller, their fronds arching overhead, to form a lacy canopy through which the last light filtered in soft, broken patterns. Then the first true trees appeared, hazel and birch, their trunks slender and pale, their leaves trembling in the gentlest currents of air. And with each step the sounds of the open valley grew softer. The hush was not a dark hush, nor a lonely one. Rather, it was the kind of stillness that belongs to places where many years have passed gently. A stillness of roots, moss, shade, and filtered light. A stillness that asks for slower footsteps, for quieter breathing, for the kind of attention that listens not just with the ears, but with the whole self. It was a living stillness, not empty, but full, not silent, but softly sounding, filled with the tiny voices of growing things and resting things, and the slow, patient movement of sap through wood and water, through earth. A stillness that asks for slower footsteps. And Elwyn, who understood such things without needing to be told, slowed his pace accordingly. The earth beneath the path was springy with leaves and soft old needles. Each footfall gave slightly, then held firm, as though the ground itself were cushioning his steps. The leaves were not fresh, but old, layers upon layers of them, the brown and gold and russet of many autumns, pressed together by time and rain into a soft, fragrant carpet. Beneath them, the earth was dark and rich, smelling of all the slow, quiet processes by which fallen things become part of the living ground. Ferns grew high on either side, their delicate fronds unfurling like green feathers, like the wings of sleeping birds, like the pages of a book opening itself to the light. They were the most graceful of plants, each frond a complex architecture of stems and leaflets, each leaflet a smaller version of the whole, repeating the same pattern at every scale, from the broad sweep of the main frond down to the tiniest curling tip. In the fading light, they seemed almost translucent. Their green deepened to emerald in the shadows, lightened to lime where the last sun touched them. Hazel branches arched overhead, their catkins long since gone, their leaves broad and slightly rough, overlapping in a loose canopy that filtered the sky into fragments of deepening blue. Here and there, a branch had grown in a gentle curve, as though reaching toward a companion across the path, and some had met and intertwined, forming natural arches through which Elwyn passed like a pilgrim entering the nave of a very green, very quiet cathedral. Wildflowers, pale and sleepy, nodded in the lower shadows. Wood anemones, their white petals tinged with pink, grew in small clusters at the bases of trees, their stems so slender that the faintest breath of air set them swaying. Wood sorrel spread its trefoil leaves like tiny green hearts across the mossy ground, and here and there in the deepest shade grew pale woodland violets, their flowers so small and so perfectly formed that they seemed less like living things than like delicate works of art placed carefully among the roots by some invisible hand. Every stone seemed thick with moss, not the thin, sparse moss of exposed walls, but deep, luxuriant moss, the kind that grows in places where the air is always damp and the light always gentle. It covered the stones in thick green cushions, soft as velvet, cool to the touch, filling every crevice and hollow with its patient, silent growth. When Elwyn's foot brushed against a mossy stone, the moss gave way beneath his toe, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, rose again, as though remembering its shape. Every fallen branch was softened by time. The wood had long since lost its sharpness, its edges rounded by seasons of rain and frost and the quiet work of fungi. Some branches were covered in bracket fungus, flat, shelf-like growths in shades of brown and cream as smooth as polished leather. Others were furred with lichen, pale gray-green, lace-like, ancient, that grew so slowly it might take a decade to cover an inch of bark, as though it had all the time in the world and saw no reason to hurry. Elwyn walked carefully, breathing in the scent of damp bark, crushed fern, and cool evening soil. Each breath was like drinking something, not water exactly, but something cool and green and nourishing, something that seemed to enter not just his lungs but his whole body, easing the tension in his muscles, softening the ache in his feet, quieting the last busy whispers of his thoughts. When the sounds of the valley did not disappear entirely, but they grew distant, as if heard through layers of leaves. The stream still murmured somewhere below, its voice reaching up through the trees in soft, intermittent phrases, like a song heard from another room. A bird called now and then, a single note, a brief descending phrase, then silence. But the grove had its own kind of silence, a deep and leafy silence made not of absence, but of listening. It was the kind of silence that one finds in old libraries, in empty churches, in rooms where someone has been thinking deeply for a very long time. A silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention, as though the trees, the moss, the ferns, the very earth were all quietly aware of everything that moved and breathed within the grove, and were holding that awareness gently, the way one holds a sleeping bird in cupped hands. The path curved. A little farther on it curved again. Each turn revealed a new vista of green shadow and filtered light, a moss-covered boulder here, a cluster of pale toadstools there, a fallen tree now become a garden of ferns and small flowers, its trunk so softened by time that it seemed less like something that had died than something that had simply changed its way of being alive. And with each turn, Elwyn felt more and more that he had entered a place not hidden by accident, but kept hidden by kindness. There was a tenderness in the way the branches arched. There was a care in the way the moss covered every sharp edge. There was a gentleness in the way the light fell, always softly, always warmly, always in that particular shade of amber green that belongs to the deepest, oldest parts of the wood, where the trees have grown so tall and so close that the light must filter down through many layers of leaf before it reaches the ground. And there were tiny lights in the undergrowth. At first, he thought they were fireflies, and perhaps some were. Those small, ordinary miracles of summer evenings carrying their cold green lanterns through the dusk. But some of the lights seemed steadier, warmer, almost golden, as though they came not from living insects, but from the earth itself, or from the roots, or from some source so ancient and so gentle that it had no name and needed none. They glimmered near roots and vanished when looked at directly, always just at the edge of vision, always just beyond the reach of full attention, like stars that can only be seen when one looks slightly to the side. Elwyn did not chase them. He did not bend down to examine them. He did not wonder about them overmuch. He simply noticed them and went on, accepting them as part of this place, part of its quiet strangeness, in part of whatever gentle magic it had gathered to itself over the long, patient years of its existence. Above him, the first stars had begun to appear between the branches. The sky, visible only in fragments now through the canopy of leaves, was turning that deep, gentle blue that comes after sunset when the day has fully let go of the earth. It was a blue that seemed to have depth, not the flat, bright blue of noon, but a blue that went on, a deepening layer by layer into something vast and dark and infinitely peaceful, like a sea seen from a very great height, like a silence heard from a very great distance. The stars within it were small and clear. Each one seemed to pulse very slightly, as though breathing, or as though the air between Elwyn and the stars was breathing, rising and falling in long, slow waves that made the light tremble. Elwyn felt no fear, only a growing sense of calm, a calm that began in his chest and spread outward to his shoulders, which dropped lower, to his hands, which unclenched around his walking stick, to his face, which softened into an expression of quiet wonder, to his feet, which moved more and more slowly, as though each step were not a means of getting somewhere, but a pleasure in itself. It is a strange thing, perhaps, to say that one can feel safe in a place never seen before. We are taught to be wary of the unfamiliar, to guard ourselves against the unknown, to keep our defenses raised until the world has proven itself worthy of our trust. And there is wisdom in that caution, wisdom earned through hard experience, through the long, difficult lessons of a world that is not always kind. But now and then, a road leads not merely onward, but inward, toward some quiet center where the heart, without quite knowing why, recognizes a familiar peace. It is the peace one feels on returning home after a long absence, but deeper, older, as though the home one is returning to is not a house, or a village, or even a country, but something more fundamental, more ancient, something woven into the very fabric of what it means to be alive. So, it was for Elwyn. He could not have explained it in words. He could not have told you why this grove, which he had never seen before, felt as familiar as his own garden path. And he could not have said what it was about the light, the moss, the arching branches, the gentle hidden path that made him feel as though he had not stumbled upon this place, but had been gently, patiently, kindly guided to it. He only knew that he was calm, that he was safe, that the tiredness in his body was not a burden, but a gift. The gift of a day fully lived, now offering itself willingly to the night. He passed a cluster of pale mushrooms at the foot of an ash tree. Small, delicate things, their caps the color of cream, their stems thin and translucent, growing in a perfect circle on the dark earth. They seemed to glow faintly in the dimness, as though lit from within. He stepped over a root thick as a sleeping hound, a great gnarled, earth-dark root that crossed the path like a threshold, worn smooth on its upper surface by the passage of feet over many years, and perhaps many generations. He brushed his hand against ivy cool with evening dew, the leaves glossy and dark, beaded with moisture, each droplet catching the last light and holding it like a tiny, perfect jewel. And then the path opened. The trees drew apart. The ferns fell away. The canopy lifted, and above him the sky was suddenly wide and deep, a great bowl of darkening blue set with the first bright stars. And before him stood the oak, part 3, the old oak. It rose at the center of the grove like something older than memory. No other word suited it. Old was the word that came first, and old was the word that remained because every other word, great, vast, ancient, noble, immense, seemed to describe only a part of what this tree was, while old described its essence, its fundamental nature, the deep, unshakable fact of its long, long, patient being. The oak was immense, not merely large, but deeply ancient, shaped by many winters, many storms, many summers of leaf and bird song and stillness. Its trunk was broad and furrowed, wide enough that 3 hobbits joining hands could not have encircled it. The bark was silver brown and ridged in long, folded lines like the surface of a very old face, a face that had seen everything and judged nothing, that had watched the centuries pass with the same calm, unhurried attention. Deep grooves ran vertically down its trunk, and between them the bark rose in thick, rounded ridges, each one textured with tiny cracks and crevices and patches of lichen, gray and gold and pale green, that made the surface a landscape in miniature, a world of its own. At the base, where the trunk met the earth, the bark was even thicker, even more deeply furrowed, darkened by centuries of moisture and shadow and the slow accumulation of soil and leaf. The transition from trunk to root was gradual and graceful. The tree did not end at the ground, but flowed into it, its great roots spreading outward like the foundations of a hill, rising and falling across the earth in thick, sinuous lines before plunging down into the darkness of the soil. Its roots spread into the earth like the foundation of a hill. They were vast. They radiated outward from the trunk in every direction, some running just beneath the surface of the ground, raising the earth into long, rounded ridges covered in moss and small ferns, others diving deep, disappearing into the black earth with a purposefulness that suggested they went down a very long way indeed. Where they broke the surface, they were smooth and gray, worn by weather and the passage of feet and the slow, patient rubbing of centuries. Where they dipped beneath the ground, they were dark with earth and moisture. and from their lower surfaces fine rootlets descended, pale and thread-like, reaching always downward, always seeking, always drinking. Its branches reached high, higher than the other trees, and then outward in great sheltering arms, as though they had spent centuries learning how best to hold the sky. The lower branches were thick and heavy, each one a tree in itself, their girth greater than the trunks of the hazels and birches that surrounded the grove. They reached outward from the trunk in broad horizontal sweeps, then curved gently upward at their tips, as though lifting handfuls of leaves toward the light. Some had been broken at some point in their long history, by wind, by lightning, by the simple weight of time. And from these breaks, new growth had emerged, younger branches sprouting from the old wood with the patience and determination of life that will not be discouraged. Higher up, the branches divided and redivided, growing finer and more numerous as they rose, until the upper canopy was a vast, intricate network of twigs and leaves that spread across the sky like a second sky, green and rustling, filtering the starlight into soft, scattered points. The leaves were broad and lobed, the classic shape of the oak leaf, that shape which is at once simple and complex, regular and varied, each leaf slightly different from its neighbor, each one a small, perfect expression of the tree's nature. In the fading light, they were dark green above and silvery below, and as the breeze moved through them, they showed their two faces alternately, green then silver, in a slow, shimmering dance that seemed less like the movement of individual leaves than the breathing of the tree as a whole. Elwyn stopped at once. Even tired as he was, even with night now gathering, he felt the need to stand quietly before the tree. It was not a decision. It was not a choice. It was simply what the moment required, the way that the sight of a mountain requires one to stop and look, the way that the sound of a great bell requires one to stop and listen. The oak asked for nothing. It demanded nothing. It simply was, and in its being, it created around itself a space of such calm, such depth, such gentle, sheltering presence, that to rush past it would have been as unthinkable as running through a prayer. So Elwyn stood. He stood and he looked. He looked at the trunk, rising massive and still from its bed of roots. He looked at the branches, spreading wide against the stars. He looked at the leaves, turning softly in the evening air. He looked at the way the tree held its space, not aggressively, not defensively, but with the quiet, absolute confidence of something that has been standing in exactly this spot since long before anyone thought to ask why. The grove itself seemed to lean around it. In the other trees, the hazels, the birches, the alders, grew in a loose circle around the oak, as though gathered around it for warmth or for counsel. Their branches did not reach toward it or compete with it. Rather, they inclined gently inward, creating a natural amphitheater with the oak at its center. The undergrowth, too, seemed to acknowledge the tree's presence. The ferns grew thicker at its base. The moss was softer there, the flowers more numerous, as though the oak's shadow were not a deprivation of light, but a gift of shelter. The ferns grew thicker at its base, their fronds longer and more luxuriant than anywhere else in the grove, as though the earth near the oak were richer, or the air gentler, or the rain softer. The moss was softer there, deep, verdant, impossibly plush, covering the roots and the ground around them in a continuous carpet that invited the hand, the cheek, the whole weary body. The air felt cooler and gentler, as though the tree were exhaling its own atmosphere. A private, enclosed space of filtered air, green-scented, damp, calm, several degrees removed from the rest of the world. And beneath the vast turning of its roots, half hidden in green shadow and amber light, was something Elwyn could scarcely believe. A hollow, not a rough hole in the earth, nor a dark opening beneath tangled wood, not a damp, uncomfortable gap between roots where one might curl up in desperation and spend a miserable night, but a natural shelter shaped with such grace that it looked almost prepared. The roots curved outward and upward, forming a kind of chamber, an alcove, a bower, a room. Two great roots served as walls, rising from the earth on either side of the entrance, in thick, smooth arcs that met overhead in a natural vault. A third root, broader and flatter, formed a kind of floor, its upper surface worn smooth and covered in a thick layer of moss and dry leaves. At the back, where the roots joined the trunk, the bark rose in a gentle curve, forming a wall that was both firm and slightly yielding, padded by centuries of growth and the slow accumulation of organic matter. Inside, the ground was thick with moss, dry leaves, and soft earth. The moss was extraordinary. It was deep and dense, and the color of emerald in shadow. And when Elwyn knelt and pressed his hand into it, it gave way beneath his palm with a yielding softness that was more like down than plant, more like a mattress crafted by some small, meticulous hand than the random growth of nature. It sprang back slowly when he lifted his hand, holding the impression of his fingers for a moment before resuming its former shape. The dry leaves were old oak leaves, broad, lobed, brown and gold and amber, layered thick beneath the moss, forming a natural padding that insulated the floor from the cold earth below. They rustled very softly when touched, a dry, papery, deeply comforting sound. There were no thorns, no stones sharp enough to trouble sleep, no damp places, no cold draughts, no uncomfortable angles. A faint warm glow seemed to rest within the hollow, not bright enough to dazzle, only enough to make it seem welcoming. A soft amber luminance that seemed to come from the bark itself, or from the spaces where root met earth, or from some deeper source within the wood, as though the tree kept within its heartwood a memory of sunlight, stored away over long summers, now released slowly, gently, in a warmth that was more felt than seen. Elwyn blinked, then blinked again. He stepped closer, ducking slightly beneath the arch of roots, and looked into the hollow with the careful attention of a hobbit who cannot quite believe his luck, but does not intend to argue with it. The moss looked softer than many beds he had slept in. The roots formed a ceiling strong and broad, high enough that he could sit upright without stooping. There was room enough for him to sit, lie down, stretch out his legs, and draw his blanket around him in comfort. A few tiny white flowers grew from the edge of the earth beside the entrance, small, star-shaped, delicate beyond telling, their petals so fine that they were almost transparent, catching the faint glow from within the hollow and shining with a soft, pearly light. Above, leaves moved in slow conversation with the wind, their rustling so gentle and so continuous that it was less a sound than a texture, a soft, enveloping presence that seemed to wrap itself around everything within the grove. Elwyn put a hand upon the bark of the oak. It was cool, deeply grooved beneath his palm, firm with the firmness of something that has stood for centuries and intends to stand for centuries more. Still with a stillness that was not the stillness of stone, but something alive, a stillness that contained within itself the slow pulse of sap, the patient growth of wood, the deep, continuing process of being that a tree carries out in silence, day after day, year after year, century after century. And yet, as his palm rested there, he felt something so quiet and steady that it almost took the shape of welcome. No words were spoken, no voice answered him from the tree, no sign appeared upon the bark, no light flashed, no music sounded, yet the feeling remained. It was like the feeling of opening a door and smelling bread baking, like the feeling of turning a corner and seeing unexpectedly the lit windows of one's own home, like the feeling of being recognized by someone one has not seen in a long time. The warmth of it, the relief of it, the simple, profound comfort of being known and accepted. This place, somehow, was meant for rest. Elwyn set down his satchel upon a flat root near the entrance. "Well," he whispered, so softly that even the nearest leaf scarcely heard him, "I think I may have found where the road meant me to sleep." And with that, he entered the hollow beneath the old oak, and the grove seemed to settle around him, as though it had been waiting for exactly this, and was now, at last, content. Part 4. A bed of moss and root. Inside, the shelter was even warmer than it had seemed from without. The air within the hollow was still and calm, but insulated by the thick walls of root and bark from the breezes that moved through the grove outside. It was not stuffy. There was a gentle circulation, a slow exchange of air between the hollow and the night that kept the atmosphere fresh. But it was noticeably warmer, as though the tree's mass absorbed and held the warmth of the day and released it slowly through the night, like a great living hearth. The earth beneath the moss was dry and firm. Whatever moisture the rain brought to the grove, the roots above channeled it away from the hollow, directing it outward along their ridged surfaces to drain into the earth beyond. The ground here was dry and slightly warm, protected and sheltered, and perfectly suited for sleep. The roots enclosed the space in a natural curve, protective but not confining. Elwyn could see the sky through the entrance, a slice of deepening blue, and now scattered with stars, and through small gaps between the roots, where the bark had worn thin or the wood had grown apart, fragments of the grove were visible, a fern frond, a patch of moss, a distant glimmer of the golden lights that floated among the trees. The glow, whatever its source, came softly from the bark and from the small spaces where root met earth, as if the tree itself kept a memory of daylight hidden within its oldest wood, of releasing it now in the gentlest possible way, not as illumination, but as comfort, the way a candle left burning in a window is not meant to light a room, but to say, "Welcome." Elwyn knelt first. The moss received his knees with a softness that made him exhale in wonder. It was like kneeling on a cushion. No, better than a cushion, because a cushion is made of cloth and stuffing and eventually compresses under weight, while this moss seemed to support him at every point, distributing his weight across its surface with a gentleness that felt almost intelligent, almost deliberate. Then he sat, and then, because he could not help it, he gave the kind of long, relieved sigh that only a very tired traveler knows. It was a sigh that began somewhere deep in his chest and rose slowly outward, carrying with it the accumulated weariness of the day. Every mile of walking, every hill climbed, every stile crossed, every moment of wondering where he would sleep, It left his body like steam from a kettle, taking the tension with it, and in its wake he felt lighter, softer, more peaceful. "This," he murmured, looking around the hollow with the expression of a hobbit who has found unexpected treasure, "is a very fine place indeed." He took off his shoes and flexed his toes in gratitude. Oh, the relief of it! The blessed, beautiful, indescribable relief of removing shoes after a long day's walk. Each toe seemed to expand and breathe, celebrating its freedom from leather and lacing. The cool air of the hollow moved over his feet, and the moss, where his toes touched it, was deliciously cool and soft. He wiggled his toes experimentally. The moss yielded. He wiggled them again. The moss yielded again. This was, he decided, an arrangement of considerable merit. He rolled out his blanket over the moss. The blanket, familiar and worn, settled over the green surface like a second skin, taking on the shape of the ground beneath, its wool soft against the living cushion of the moss. The result was a bed, a proper bed by Hobbit standards, that would have been the envy of many an inn and more than a few private homes. He placed his satchel near his head, where it would serve as a pillow if required, though the moss itself was thick enough to pillow his head without assistance. From the satchel he drew the last crust of bread, his little cup, and the packet of dried mint, though there was as yet no water to warm for tea. Still, merely arranging his things made the hollow feel more and more like a room made by roots, a room older than cottages, older than castles, older than the oldest building in the oldest city. A room lined not with boards and plaster, but with bark, leaf shadow, and the patience of centuries. A room that had been here before the stone walls in the valley had been laid, before the bridges had been built, before the lanes had been worn into the earth by the feet of farmers and their children and their children's children. A room that would be here still when all those things had crumbled and been forgotten, when the walls had sunk back into the earth and the bridges had been carried away by floods and the lanes had been reclaimed by grass and wildflower. He leaned back against one of the great roots. The root was smooth and firm against his back, its curve exactly right for the curve of his spine, as though it had been shaped not by the blind processes of growth, but by some gentle intention, some quiet awareness of the bodies that would one day rest against it. He settled into it with a sigh, adjusting his position until every part of his back was supported, every tension eased, every muscle allowed to release its grip. The smell inside the hollow was beautiful in its simplicity. Cool moss, that green, clean, slightly mineral scent that belongs to places where water and shade and patience have been working together for a very long time. Old wood, deep, warm, slightly sweet, the smell of heartwood and sapwood and bark, of sap long dried and wood long seasoned, of a living thing that has been growing for so long that its very substance has become a kind of perfume. Leaf mold, rich and dark and earthy, the smell of all the autumns that have passed beneath this tree, all the leaves that have fallen and softened and crumbled and been drawn down into the soil to feed the roots that grew them. Earth, the deepest smell of all, the foundation, the base note, the smell of the world itself, cool and dark and infinitely patient, and a faint sweetness like dried hay and distant apples, a sweetness that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, or from the wood and the moss and the air itself, a sweetness that was not cloying or strong but simply present, like a memory of orchards in late summer, like the lingering scent of a harvest long gathered. Outside, night deepened. The grove shifted into darker blues and greens, the colors of the canopy blending and darkening until the individual trees were no longer distinct, but had become a single surrounding presence, a wall of living shadow, protective and encompassing. Somewhere above, an owl called once, a low, rounded sound like a note blown softly across the mouth of a bottle. It was not a lonely sound, though it was solitary. It was the sound of a creature perfectly at home in the dark, perfectly content with the night, perfectly at ease with its own existence. It called once, paused, and then was silent, as though it had said everything it needed to say. Crickets continued their thin and endless music, a sound so constant and so pervasive that it soon ceased to be a separate sound and became part of the silence, part of the texture of the night, as natural and as unnoticeable as one's own breathing. The stream below the hill went on speaking over stones in the same patient tone it must have used for years beyond counting. A continuous, murmuring, endlessly varied voice that spoke of nothing and everything, of water and stone and the slow passage of time, of the journey from spring to sea, from mountain to meadow, from rain to river to rain again. Elwyn felt drowsiness draw closer. It came like a tide, slow, inevitable, gentle. It rose within him, softening the edges of his thoughts, blurring the boundaries between waking and sleep, between here and elsewhere, between now and then. His eyelids grew heavier, his breathing deepened. The sounds of the night seemed to recede slightly, as though moving to a greater distance and giving him room to drift. But just then he heard something else. Footsteps, not hurried, not heavy, not the sharp, purposeful tread of someone with urgent business, only soft, regular footfalls moving along the hidden path, the gentle, measured steps of someone who knew the way well and was in no hurry to reach the end of it. He sat up a little straighter, blinking the first haze of sleep from his eyes, and looked toward the entrance of the hollow. A lantern glow approached through the grove. It moved between the trunks of the trees in a slow, steady arc, casting soft, moving shadows across the ferns and the mossy ground. The light was warm, warmer than starlight, warmer than moonlight, the rich golden warmth of a candle flame enclosed in glass, and it illuminated the grove in a gentle circle, making the leaves glow and the bark shine, and the tiny drops of dew on the fern fronds sparkle like scattered jewels. Then a woman appeared. She walked calmly along the path, her steps sure and unhurried, moving between the ferns and the roots with the ease of someone who had walked this way many times before. She was neither young nor old, or rather, she seemed to be that age which is both, which carries the warmth of youth and the steadiness of years in equal measure. She wore a brown cloak, practical and well-made, of the kind that is woven to last and softens with wearing, unfastened at the throat with a simple clasp of polished copper. Her hair was braided neatly beneath a woolen hood, a few strands escaping at her temples, dark against the warmth of her skin. In one hand she held a lantern, a small, well-made lantern of tin and glass, its flame steady and bright within its little house of light. In the other she carried a covered basket, a wide, flat basket with a handle, of the kind used for carrying bread and provisions, its contents hidden beneath a clean cloth of pale linen. She seemed entirely unsurprised to find Elwyn beneath the tree. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was warm and clear, pitched low, the kind of voice that puts a listener at ease without trying, the kind of voice one might hear in a warm kitchen or a quiet garden, a voice made for simple, kind conversations and old, slow songs. "Good evening," Elwyn answered from the entrance of his hollow, his voice still thick with the first approaches of sleep. "You found the oak." "I believe it found me," said Elwyn, which made the woman smile. It was a good smile, not wide, not dramatic, but genuine, reaching her eyes, crinkling the skin at their corners, expressing a pleasure that was quiet and real. "That happens," she said, nodding slightly, as though this were the most natural thing in the world, as ordinary and as expected as rain after thunder or warmth after sunrise. She stepped nearer and set the lantern down on a flat stone near the entrance of the hollow, a stone that seemed placed there for exactly this purpose, worn smooth on its upper surface, the right height and the right distance to cast its light into the shelter without being too bright or too close. Its warm light joined the softer amber glow of the hollow, and together they created a circle of illumination that was gentle and inviting, like a room lit by two candles, warm enough to see by, dim enough to sleep by. "I am Mara," she said. "I keep the inn in Brookbend village down by the stream." Elwyn rose as much as the root above allowed, which was not very much, as the ceiling of the hollow was designed for lying down rather than standing up, and bowed politely, managing a creditable bow despite the constraints of his position, his hand upon his chest in the old manner. "Elwyn Bramblefoot," he said, "traveler of moderate ambition and increasingly tired feet." Mara laughed very softly. It was a laugh like the lantern light, warm, contained, real, not loud, not prolonged, but unmistakably a laugh, expressing a genuine and uncomplicated amusement. "That is an honest introduction," she said, "and you look in need of supper." She lifted the cloth from the basket. The smell that rose into the hollow was so comforting that Elwyn nearly closed his eyes on the spot. It was not a single smell, but a chorus of smells, each one distinct and yet blending with the others into something that was more than the sum of its parts, a symphony of nourishment and care, of kitchen warmth and loving preparation. Fresh bread, still faintly warm from the oven, its crust golden brown and crackled, its interior soft and pale, the yeasty, wheaty, but deeply satisfying smell of bread made by someone who has been baking all their life and knows exactly how long to let the dough rise, exactly how hot the oven should be, exactly when to take the loaf from the stone and wrap it in cloth to keep it warm. Butter, pale creamy, flecked with tiny green specks of herbs, smelling of cream and clover and the faintest hint of salt. A little broth in a flask, sealed with a cork, but even so the smell seeped through. A rich and savory and deeply warming, the smell of onions and leeks and thyme simmered together for hours, reduced to a concentrated essence of comfort, and, wrapped in linen, what looked very much like honey cake, golden brown, dense, fragrant, the kind of cake that is more sustenance than sweetness, made with dark honey and butter and a generous measure of care. "I thought," said Mara, "that if the oak had invited a guest tonight, the least we in the village could do was send a meal." Elwyn looked from the basket to Mara, then to the tree, then back again. His mouth had opened slightly, his eyes were wide. His expression was one of such guileless, uncomplicated gratitude that Mara smiled again, wider this time. "That," he said, with the earnest conviction of a hobbit who takes meals very seriously indeed, is one of the finest customs I have ever heard of. And truly it was. On part 5, the kindly innkeeper's basket, Mara sat upon one of the roots near the entrance, her cloak gathered around her, her back against the bark, her posture that of someone who is comfortable being still, who does not fidget or fuss, but simply settles into the moment and allows it to be what it is. The lantern light played softly over her face, and beyond her the grove was dark and quiet, the ferns still. And the night gathered close around the oak like a blanket drawn over a sleeping child. Elwyn, with many grateful words, more words perhaps than the occasion strictly required, but hobbits are expressive creatures when it comes to food and kindness, accepted the meal. The bread was still faintly warm. He tore it with his hands rather than cutting it. The proper way, the old way, the way that lets the bread break along its own grain, revealing the soft, airy interior, releasing a puff of warm, yeasty fragrance that rose into the hollow like a blessing. The crust crackled between his fingers, and tiny flakes of it fell upon his blanket like golden crumbs of autumn. The butter carried the taste of herbs, chives perhaps, or parsley, or the faintest suggestion of sage. It was soft enough to spread easily, even without a knife, and Elwyn applied it to his bread with his brass spoon, spreading it thick and even, watching it melt slightly into the warm surface, turning the pale bread golden and glossy. The first bite was extraordinary, not in the way that a feast is extraordinary, with its many dishes and its spectacle and its noise. Extraordinary in the way that the simplest things are extraordinary when they are perfect, when the bread is just right, and the butter is just right, and the hunger is honest, and the place is peaceful, and the person eating is grateful. The bread was dense and flavorful, the crust giving way to the soft interior with a satisfying texture, the herbs in the butter mingling with the wheaty taste of the loaf. Elwyn closed his eyes and chewed slowly, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to this single perfect bite. The broth was rich with onion, leek, and thyme. Mara poured it from the flask into Elwyn's cup. His own cup, the chipped one with the forget-me-nots, and it steamed gently in the cool air of the hollow, sending up curls of fragrant vapor that twisted and disappeared in the lamplight. It was a golden-brown broth, clear but rich, the color of amber, the kind of broth that is the product not of haste but of hours, the slow extraction of flavor from honest ingredients simmered with patience and attention. Elwyn held the cup in both hands and drank. The warmth of it spread through him like sunlight through a cold room. He felt it in his throat, in his chest, in his stomach, and then, radiating outward, reaching his fingers and his toes, easing the last deep aches of the day's walking, softening the tiredness in his muscles, filling him from the inside with a gentle, pervasive heat that was more than physical, that felt like comfort itself, made liquid and warm and drinkable. The honey cake was dense and fragrant, with just enough spice to make it feel like autumn, even in a green season. He ate it in small pieces, breaking off fragments with his fingers and letting each one dissolve slowly on his tongue. The honey was dark. Wildflower honey, he thought, or perhaps heather, and it had a depth of flavor that went beyond sweetness, carrying within it the taste of blossoms and sunshine and bee flight, and the slow, complex alchemy by which nectar becomes honey. The spice was gentle, cinnamon perhaps, or nutmeg, or some combination of the two, just enough to warm the tongue without sharpness, as to add a note of depth and complexity to the sweetness without overwhelming it. Elwyn ate slowly, not only because he was polite, though he was, and not only because he wished to make such goodness last, though he did, but because the night itself seemed to ask for slowness. Nothing in the grove wished to be hurried. The lantern burned steadily, its flame scarcely flickering, as though even the air within the grove respected the stillness of the hour. The leaves above whispered in low, patient waves, each rustle a long, drawn-out exhalation of sound that faded slowly into silence before the next began. Beyond the entrance of the hollow, fireflies drifted among the ferns like bits of quiet starlight come down to earth, their lights pulsing in slow, irregular rhythms, now here, now there, now gone, now returning. The whole world seemed to be breathing very slowly, very deeply, in the long, a steady rhythm of something vast and ancient and utterly at peace. Mara watched the night as Elwyn ate. She did not seem impatient. She did not check the hour, or glance toward the path, or show any sign of wishing to be elsewhere. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes resting on the dark shapes of the grove, with an expression of calm familiarity, as though this grove, this tree, this night were old companions of hers, known and trusted and loved. At last Elwyn asked, his voice soft and curious, "Do many travelers sleep here?" "Not many," she said, "only those who truly need rest." There was a gentleness in the way she said it, not pity, not solemnity, but a simple, warm recognition that rest is a real need, as real as hunger or thirst, and that those who need it most deserve it most. Elwyn glanced upward at the vast arch of roots and trunk above him, at the ancient bark with its deep grooves and its patches of lichen, at the leaves turning slowly against the stars. "And the village sends them baskets?" Mara nodded. "When we know they are here." "How do you know?" At that, she smiled again, the way one smiles at old customs too familiar to explain plainly, customs so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that they have become less rules than instincts, less practices than ways of being. "The valley has its ways," she said. "A shepherd sees a lantern where none was lit, a glow among the trees at the edge of the grove, brief and golden, gone before he can be certain he saw it at all, but enough to make him mention it at supper. A child dreams of the oak, dreams of its branches and its roots and its deep, sheltering hollow, and wakes in the morning with a certainty unshakable and serene that someone is sleeping there. A dog insists upon walking the hidden path and will not come back until someone follows. Once, years ago, my grandmother said the bell in the tower rang once in still air, though no one had touched the rope and no wind stirred. Whenever such things happen, we look to the grove." Elwyn found this entirely reasonable. It was the kind of arrangement that made perfect sense to a hobbit. Practical, communal, rooted in attention to the small signs of the world, in the habit of noticing and the willingness to act on what one notices. It was not grand or magical in any showy way. It was simply the kind of quiet understanding that develops between people and the land they live on, the kind of knowledge that cannot be written in books because it is too subtle, too intuitive, too much a matter of feel and sense and long experience. Mara went on. "The oak has stood longer than our houses, longer than the bridge, perhaps longer than the road itself. It has watched over shepherds, wanderers, woodcutters, children, lovers, widowers, tired mothers, old men with market carts, and one very sleepy fiddler who snored so deeply beneath its roots that he missed half the morning and woke to find a squirrel sitting on his chest, studying him with what he described as considerable academic interest. Elwyn smiled into his cup, the warmth of the broth rising against his face. "It sounds," he said, "like a very noble tree." "It is," Mara said, "but also a practical one. It knows the worth of sleep." At this, Elwyn liked the oak more than ever. There is a special pleasure in discovering that something noble is also sensible, that greatness and good sense can coexist, that the most ancient and impressive things in the world can also be the most down-to-earth, the most practically useful, the most dedicated to the simple, in fundamental business of keeping people warm and rested and safe. When he had finished the broth and the bread, Mara poured water from a small flask over the mint leaves into his cup. It was not hot, but cool and fragrant. The scent rose fresh and soft into the hollow, cutting gently through the warm smells of bread and broth and honey, adding a bright green note to the air, clean and awakening, and at the same time deeply soothing. The paradox of mint, which refreshes and relaxes in equal measure. Elwyn drank. The mint tasted of gardens at dusk, stone wells, and quiet kitchen shelves. It tasted of his own little garden at home, where the mint grew in a clay pot by the back door, spreading its roots in all directions with the cheerful ambition that is characteristic of mint, threatening to take over the thyme and the parsley, if not regularly discouraged. It tasted of summers past and summers yet to come. It tasted of the simple, unrepeatable pleasures that are the foundation of a happy life. Small things, done often, done well, done with attention and gratitude. A perfect taste for the closing of day. They sat for a while without speaking. It was the sort of silence that feels companionable at once, not the awkward silence of strangers who cannot think of what to say, nor the tense silence of people avoiding a difficult subject, but the warm, easy silence of two souls who are content to share a moment without filling it with words. No effort, no need to fill it, only the lantern, the roots, the slow settling of the night, and the gentle understanding that all was well. The silence of the grove wrapped around them like another layer of shelter, like another blanket, like the night itself gathered close and held in the arms of the old tree. And within that silence, Elwyn felt something shift, felt some last inner resistance soften, some final tension release, as though the deepest, most guarded part of himself had finally been reached by the peace of this place and had consented, at last, to let go. At last, Mara stood, brushing a few leaf fragments from her cloak. "The inn is called the Lantern at Brookbend," she said. "If you follow the stream in the morning, you will find us. The path from the grove meets the water just past the bridge, and the stream will lead you straight to our door." "I believe I shall," said Elwyn, with the quiet certainty of a hobbit who knows a good thing when he finds it. Mara picked up the empty cloths, but left the honey cake. "For the morning," she said, wrapping it again in the linen and setting it beside his satchel. "The oak does not serve breakfast, but it does not mind if guests bring their own." "Then sleep well," she said, "or the oak keeps good watch." And with that, she took up the lantern and departed the way she had come, her light moving gradually between the trunks until it became only a warm dot among the dark shapes of the trees, then a faint glow, then nothing at all. Elwyn watched until the grove returned fully to itself. The darkness seemed to deepen slightly in the absence of the lantern, but it was not a cold or threatening darkness. It was the soft, living darkness of a place that has always been dark at night and has never found this to be a problem. A darkness made of shadow and starlight and the faint amber glow of the hollow, warm and close and deeply, deeply safe. Then Elwyn settled back into the hollow, and the old oak seemed to draw the whole night gently closer, like a grandmother drawing a blanket over a sleeping child, tucking the edges in with care, making sure that no cold draught could find its way through. But Part 6, the first, Sleep Beneath the Tree. Elwyn folded his coat beneath his head and stretched out upon the blanket. Every part of him seemed to sigh with relief. His back, which had been carrying the weight of the satchel all day, now lay flat and supported against the soft, yielding surface of the moss. His legs, which had been walking since morning, stretched out to their full length, and the muscles in his calves and thighs loosened and softened, releasing the day's tension in slow, pleasant waves. His arms lay at his sides, heavy and warm, his hands uncurled, his fingers relaxing into gentle curves against the blanket. The moss beneath him was soft and springy, giving way just enough to cradle his body without letting him sink. It was the most comfortable surface he had ever lain upon, better than his mattress at home, which was good, better than the feather bed at the Green Bottle Inn, which was very good, better than any surface he could have imagined or designed. It was as though the moss had been growing for centuries with exactly this purpose in mind: to provide, when the time came, the perfect bed for a tired, small, kind-hearted traveler. The great root at his back curved like the side of a chair made for sleeping, or like the arm of someone very large and very gentle, holding him in place, keeping him safe, preventing him from rolling or sliding, offering a warm, a solid presence against which he could rest without effort. The air was cool upon his face, but the earth below held a lingering warmth. This combination, cool air above, warm earth below, created a perfect equilibrium, a balance of temperatures that seemed calculated to soothe, to comfort, to invite the deepest possible sleep. He was neither too warm nor too cold. He was simply, perfectly, exactly right. He drew the blanket over himself. The familiar weight of it settled across his body like a second pair of arms, and the wool, warmed by his own heat, began to create a cocoon of warmth that enclosed him completely. The blanket smelled of his own home, of the wooden chest where he kept it, of the lavender sachets his neighbor had given him, of wood smoke and garden air, and the indefinable, deeply personal scent of his own life. Above him, through small openings between roots and leaves, he could see pieces of the night sky, deep blue, then darker blue, then nearly black, with stars opening one by one like distant lanterns being lit by some unhurried hand in a vast, dark hall. The stars were very bright tonight. Each one seemed to burn with a steady, patient light, a light that had traveled immense distances to reach this small grove in this quiet valley, and that now rested upon the leaves and the bark and the moss with the gentleness of something that has come a very long way and is very glad to have arrived. He listened. The leaves whispered overhead, a continuous, soft, endlessly varied sound, like the breathing of the grove itself, like the murmur of voices in another room, too soft to make out words, but clear enough to convey tone. And the tone was always the same: peace, peace, all is well, peace. The stream moved below the hill, its voice reaching Elwyn through the layers of earth and root and fern, softened and filtered, and made more gentle by the distance. A murmur within a murmur, a quiet within a quiet. An owl called again, farther now, the same low, rounded note, more distant, more dreamy, as though the owl too were settling into the night, moving farther from waking, closer to that deep, instinctive stillness that the dark hours bring. Something small, perhaps a dormouse or hedgehog, rustled near the outer ferns, and then grew still. A brief, papery sound, like a page turning in a very small book, followed by silence. Elwyn's breathing slowed. Each breath came a little deeper, a little longer than the one before. The rhythm of his breathing began to match the rhythm of the grove, the slow pulse of the leaves, the steady murmur of the stream, the patient turn of the earth beneath him. He was not yet asleep, but he had entered that gentle borderland where thought no longer moves in straight lines, the borderland where memory softens and drifts, where images come unbidden and pass without leaving sharp impressions, where the mind begins to loosen its grip on the day and allow the night to take its place, the borderland where one remembers the curve of a teapot handle, warm and smooth and exactly right in the palm, the glow of a window at dusk, seen from outside, golden and inviting, the exact comfort of an old chair, its cushion shaped by years of sitting, its arms worn smooth by years of resting elbows, the smell of soup in another room, that warm, savory, deeply domestic smell that says someone is near, someone is cooking, someone is taking care. He thought of home, not with homesickness exactly, but with tenderness, the kind of tenderness one feels toward something loved and familiar when one is at a safe distance from it, able to see it whole, able to appreciate it fully, able to love it not with the blind, automatic love of daily habit, but with the clear, warm, conscious love of recognition. He thought of the round green door of his little house, green as moss, green as the first leaves of spring, with a brass knocker shaped like a bell and a small peephole at eye level, through which he had never once looked, because he always opened the door to whoever knocked, because the kind of people who visited Elwyn were invariably the kind of people he was glad to see. He thought of the polished brass knob, worn to a warm golden shine by his own hand, turning it twice a day, in and out, for years. He thought of the shelf where he kept 3 good bowls, and one that was cracked, but too beloved to throw away. A blue bowl with a white rim that his mother had used, cracked straight across the bottom, were useless for soup, but perfect for holding the small apples from the garden. He thought of his garden path, with thyme growing between the stones, wild thyme, tiny and fragrant, spreading its purple flowers through the cracks, releasing its scent whenever he walked upon it, so that every journey from the gate to the door was accompanied by a small, sweet cloud of herb smell. He thought of the teapot that always whistled just slightly off-key, a brown teapot, round and squat, or with a handle that was slightly too small for his hand and a spout that dripped, but which made, despite these imperfections, or perhaps because of them, the finest tea he had ever tasted. He smiled. The old oak creaked once in the breeze, not loudly, not sharply, only the deep, slow sound of ancient wood settling into itself, the sound of a structure so vast and so old that even the smallest movement of wind caused its timbers to shift and adjust, finding new equilibria, redistributing their weight across their massive frame. And somehow that sound was comforting too. It was the sound of something enduring, something that had been here before Elwyn arrived and would be here after he left, something that creaked and shifted and settled, Not because it was weak, but because it was alive. A living thing doing what living things do, moving with the wind, responding to the cold, adjusting to the night, and in all these movements expressing a patience and a permanence that was deeply, profoundly reassuring. Elwyn closed his eyes. The night seemed to deepen around him, not as darkness deepens in frightening places, not suddenly, not oppressively, not with the sense of something closing in, but as blankets deepen over the body when one is being tucked safely in. Layer by layer, fold by fold, each new darkness softer than the last, each new silence more spacious, each new moment of night more restful, more peaceful, more surrendered. The grove was holding him, the earth was holding him, the roots above him felt less like wood and more like shelter itself. The pure idea of shelter, the essence of what it means to be covered and protected and enclosed, distilled into this ancient living form. At last, with one soft breath that seemed to leave the whole of the day behind, the walking, the fields, the stiles, the hedgerows, the bridge, the stream, the hidden path, the grove, the meal, the lantern, all of it exhaled in one long, slow release. Elwyn slipped into sleep. Part 7. Dreams of warm doors and moonlit paths. He dreamed, as gentle souls often do, of things both familiar and strange. He dreamed of walking through a village made entirely of lantern light and round windows. The village was set into the sides of green hills, each house built beneath the earth, with round doors painted in cheerful colors, green, yellow, blue, red, and round windows through which warm golden light poured into the evening air. Smoke rose from chimneys that were really just holes in the hillside, lined with brick and topped with small clay pots. The lanes between the houses were paved with flat stones, worn smooth by many feet, and bordered by low hedges of box and lavender. Lanterns hung from poles at every corner, on their glass panels casting pools of amber light upon the ground. It was a village made for hobbits, made for comfort, made for the simple, deep pleasures of home. And in his dream, Elwyn walked through it with the feeling of one who belongs completely to the place he is in. Each house stood beneath a grassy hill, and every door was painted a different shade of green. Moss green, sage green, olive green, green with a touch of gold, where the lamplight rested upon it. The doors were round and solid, with brass hinges and iron latches and small brass nameplates engraved with names that were both strange and familiar. Behind each door, Elwyn somehow knew, was a warm room with a fire and a table and a chair and a cup of tea waiting, all the essential ingredients of happiness assembled with care and arranged with love. He dreamed of an endless supper table beneath the branches of the oak. The table was long and made of dark wood, polished to a deep shine, and it stretched away in both directions until it was lost in the green shadows of the grove. It was set with plates and cups and bowls of every description, no two alike, each one unique, each one beautiful in its own simple way. And upon the table was more food than Elwyn had ever seen in one place. Not a feast of excess, but a feast of variety and generosity, of warmth and welcome. There were warm loaves of bread, golden crusted, fragrant, steaming faintly in the cool evening air. There was blackberry jam, dark as ink, sweet and sharp, in small glass jars. There was golden butter, soft and herbed. There were soups rich with barley, with lentils, with root vegetables and herbs, served in deep bowls that warmed the hands, and there were little cakes dusted with sugar so fine they shone like moonlit frost. Delicate, tender, sweet, each one a small miracle of flour and butter and care. No plate ever emptied, no teacup ever cooled. Whenever Elwyn reached for something, there was always more. Whenever he lifted his cup, it was always full. The table seemed to replenish itself with the quiet, unhurried magic of a place where generosity is not a gesture, but a law of nature. He dreamed of a stone lane winding uphill beneath stars, where foxes walked politely beside him as though on evening errands of their own. The foxes were beautiful, their fur dark amber in the starlight, and their eyes bright and intelligent, their movements graceful and purposeful. They walked beside him without fear, without shyness, as though they and he were fellow travelers on the same road, bound for the same destination, equals in the democracy of the night. They did not speak. Foxes, even in dreams, are not great talkers, but their presence was companionable and warm, and Elwyn found himself smiling as he walked, glad of their company. He dreamed of windows glowing in distant hillsides, each one a small square of gold in the darkness, each one a promise of warmth and shelter and safety. He dreamed of songs half heard through hedges, old songs, slow songs, songs without words, melodies that rose and fell like the breathing of the hills, that wandered like streams through the meadows of sleep and found their way, eventually, to the sea of silence. He dreamed of a bell ringing once over the valley and sending a ripple of peace through the sleeping fields. A single clear note, bronze and ancient, that spread outward in concentric circles of sound and silence, touching everything, disturbing nothing, blessing the night with its brief, perfect resonance. At one point in his dream, he stood again beneath the old oak, but now it was spring. The branches were heavy with young leaves bright as emerald glass, each one new and fresh and perfect, shining with the inner light of things just born. The light through them was green and gold, shifting and dancing as the breeze moved the canopy, creating patterns of brightness and shadow on the ground below that were endlessly changing and endlessly beautiful. The roots were ringed with daffodils, violets, and wild primrose, daffodils bright as trumpets of gold, violets dark as evening, primroses pale as butter, all growing together in a profusion of color and scent that made the grove feel like a garden planted by joy itself. Children ran laughing through the grove while old dogs slept in the shade. The children's laughter was high and clear and completely without worry. The laughter of those who have never known fear, who have never needed to be afraid, who live in a world where the worst thing that can happen is that supper might be slightly delayed. And the dogs, old, gray-muzzled, heavy with years, lay in the dappled shade of the oak's lowest branches, their paws twitching slightly as they dreamed their own dog dreams, their sides rising and falling with the deep, steady breathing of creatures who have perfected the art of rest. And the oak, tall above them all, held the sunlight in green layers that moved like silk in the breeze, sheltering them all, children and dogs and flowers and earth, with the same ancient, impartial, inexhaustible kindness. Then the dream became winter. Snow lay upon the branches, a thin white covering that turned each branch and twig into a line of light, as though the tree had been drawn in white ink upon a gray page. The valley was white and still, the fields hidden beneath smooth drifts, the hedgerows turned into white. Something went wrong with this response. Please try again. I want you to expand the sleep story below into a very long, immersive fantasy bedtime story of approximately 80,000 characters. The story must remain calm, gentle, soothing, and sleep-inducing from beginning to end. Do not turn it into an action story. Do not add tension, danger, conflict, fast pacing, or dramatic twists. The goal is deep relaxation, comfort, and peaceful sleep. Title: The Hobbit Who Slept Beneath the Old Oak. Your task: take the existing story I provide and rewrite it into a much longer, richer, more detailed version while preserving its cozy fantasy soul. Expand every scene with deeper sensory detail, slower pacing, soft repetition, peaceful transitions, and beautiful descriptive writing. Make the world feel warm, ancient, safe, and dreamlike. The story should feel like a quiet journey into rest. Important writing goals: target length, around 80,000 characters. Language: English tone, soft, poetic, calming, warm. Immersive style: fantasy bedtime story for adults. Pace: very slow and flowing. Structure: keep it as a continuous narrated sleep story with smooth transitions. Make it suitable for voice narration on YouTube. Keep it emotionally comforting and easy to follow. Expand the atmosphere, much more than the plot. Prioritize rest, sleep, comfort, safety, gentle wonder, and peace world and mood. The world should feel like an ancient, peaceful fantasy countryside inspired by quiet medieval valleys, hidden forest paths, warm inns, mossy stones, old trees, lantern light, soft moonlight, distant bells, simple food, and forgotten kindness. The atmosphere must remain noble, pastoral, magical, and believable. Subtle fantasy is welcome, but it must stay gentle and never become flashy or intense. Main character: Elwyn is a humble, hobbit-like traveler. He is kind, quiet, observant, sleepy, thoughtful, and deeply comforted by small things. Warm bread, tea, blankets, candlelight, soft chairs, mossy paths, low songs, and peaceful rooms keep him consistent throughout the story. Key themes to strengthen: rest after a long, gentle journey, peaceful wandering through a green valley, hidden forest paths, ancient trees, and quiet magic. Safe places to sleep, warm food, and small comforts. Memory, home, and belonging: moonlight, dusk, and early dawn. The deep emotional comfort of being watched over by something ancient and kind. What to expand much more. The valley at evening, the stream, bridge, reeds, birds, grasses, and sky: the hidden path into the grove. The old oak and its physical presence, the sleeping hollow beneath the roots. The sounds of the night: Mara arriving with the lantern and basket. The meal scene: Elwyn's inner calm and drowsiness. The dream sequences: dawn in the Grove Brookbend village, and the inn Elwyn's quiet days of rest. They're the emotional meaning of the oak. Reflections on sleep, peace, and homecoming. Very important constraints: no battles, no villains, no fear, no dark suspense, no sharp emotional pain, no intense conflict, no loud magic effects, no sudden danger, no complicated plot twists, no modern language, no irony or sarcasm, no abrupt transitions, no overstimulation. Sleep story techniques to use: gentle repetition of comforting ideas, long descriptive paragraphs, soft rhythmic phrasing. Sensory detail: moss, bark, warm bread, broth, mint, lantern light, cool air, soft blankets, stream sounds, owls, distant bells, leaves, firelight transitions that feel like drifting deeper into rest, recurring motifs. Roots, shelter, quiet leaves, warm windows, old roads, soft night air language that encourages relaxation without directly sounding like meditation instructions too often. Narration quality. Write it so that it sounds beautiful when read aloud slowly. The sentences should flow well for bedtime narration. Avoid overly complex plot mechanics. This must feel like a gentle storytelling voice by candlelight. Output instructions. Write the full expanded story directly. Keep the title at the top. Do not summarize. Do not explain your process. Do not break immersion. Do not add notes or commentary. Just produce the story in full. Here is the base story to expand. A fantasy sleep story for deep rest. Tonight, dear traveler, you are invited to walk slowly into a quieter world, a world of soft hills and lantern light, a world of mossy paths, old trees, distant bells, and warm windows glowing against the evening. A world where no one is in a hurry, where even the wind seems to move more gently, where the oldest things still remember how to keep the night kind. So, let your breathing soften. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let the day drift a little farther away. And if you wish, imagine that you are walking now through a peaceful green valley under a sky turning gold and blue, and following a small traveler named Elwyn, a humble hobbit with round cheeks, tired feet, and a heart that always longed for home, warmth, and rest. And this is the story of the night he slept beneath the old oak. Part 1. The Gentle Road. Through the valley there was, in the western folds of an old and peaceful land, a valley so quiet that even the clouds seemed to pass above it with great care. Its hills were long and green, and their slopes covered in soft grass that bent in silver waves beneath the wind. Its streams wound slowly through the meadows like ribbons of glass, turning here and there between reeds, stones, and willow roots. Little hedges divided the fields. Old stone walls, half sunk with time and softened by moss, marked the borders of forgotten gardens and ancient lanes. At dawn, mist lay in the low places like white wool. At noon, bees wandered among clover and thyme, and in the evening, the valley glowed with that deep, quiet light that comes only just before sunset, when the world seems to exhale. It was through this valley that Elwyn Bramblefoot was walking. Elwyn was not a grand traveler. He did not seek glory. He did not chase danger. He had no map marked with dragons, no heroic errand, no shining sword, no tales of conquest to carry from inn to inn. What Elwyn carried instead was a satchel of simple things: a folded blanket, a heel of bread, a little round of cheese wrapped in cloth, an apple, a small brass spoon, a teacup with a chip in the rim, and, tucked very carefully into a side pocket, a tiny packet of dried mint leaves for tea. These, to Elwyn, were treasures enough. He was a hobbit of modest habits and soft preferences. He liked porridge on cold mornings and soup on rainy evenings. He liked polished wood, warm doors, shelves of crockery, and thick curtains drawn against the dark. He liked the sound of someone stirring a pot in the next room. He liked hearth rugs, seed cake, low songs, and chairs that knew exactly how to support a sleepy back. And, above all, Elwyn liked to be home before nightfall, which made the present situation slightly unfortunate. For though the valley was beautiful, and though the weather had been mild, and though the walk had offered many pleasant sights, a hawk circling high over the western ridge, a cart full of onions passing along a distant lane, a fox slipping like amber through the grass, the day had grown longer than Elwyn had intended. and now evening was drawing near. He paused at the crest of a hill and looked down. The light was turning. The far meadows had become softer in color. The shadows of hedgerows stretched longer over the ground. Somewhere in the distance a bell rang once, then again, from a village too far to reach before full dark. Elwyn sighed, not a troubled sigh, only the sort of sigh one gives when realizing that supper may be later than expected. "Well," he said quietly to himself, "I suppose the road has made its own plans today." He adjusted the strap of his satchel and continued onward. The path curved gently down between wild grasses and pale thistle blooms. The air smelled of warm earth, crushed herbs, and distant water. Swallows skimmed low over the fields, gathering themselves before night. Near a stone wall, a pair of rabbits sat upright in the grass and watched him with grave attention before vanishing into a tangle of roots. Elwyn smiled at them. He was tired, but not unhappy. There was something comforting in a long road when the weather was kind and the world had not yet become dark. And though he did not know exactly where he would sleep, he trusted, as many small and gentle souls do, that somewhere ahead there would be a place prepared for him. A little inn, perhaps, a cottage with lamplight in the window, a barn loft full of sweet hay, a shepherd's hut, even a sheltered tree, if it came to that. So he walked. He walked through the last of the sun-warmed fields. He crossed a narrow wooden stile polished smooth by years of passing boots. He followed a lane edged with blackberry brambles and elderflower shrubs. He listened to the valley settling into evening. There is a moment, just before dusk, when the world begins to change its voice. The bright chatter of daytime grows quieter. Birdsong becomes more occasional. The insects begin. The breeze cools, water sounds clearer, and all across the land unseen creatures begin the ancient, patient business of night. Elwyn heard that moment arrive around him. He heard a blackbird sing once from a hawthorn hedge. He heard the dry hush of grass bending in the wind. He heard the small, clicking song of crickets begin among the stones. And somewhere, from lower down in the valley, he heard the sound of a stream moving over pebbles. That, Elwyn decided, was reason enough to pause. He followed the sound until the path brought him to a little bridge, a very old bridge made of low stone and covered in patches of pale green moss. Beneath it ran a clear stream, no wider than two outstretched walking sticks, but lively enough to catch the fading light in silver pieces. Elwyn sat on the bridge wall. He took off his hat. He loosened his collar. He dipped his fingers in the stream and sighed again, this time with approval. And the water was cold and clean, a perfect sort of water, the kind that seems to come from somewhere ancient and fern-shadowed. He took out his apple and ate it slowly, looking at the valley. Above the stream, reeds moved in long, soft lines. Dragonflies hovered over the darker pools. A hedgehog rustled in the underbrush nearby with the deep seriousness of a creature entirely occupied by its own evening affairs. For a while, Elwyn simply sat. He watched the light dim. He listened to the stream. He allowed the tiredness in his legs to spread gently upward until it became not discomfort, but heaviness. And then not heaviness, but something softer still. The first invitation of rest. When at last he rose, he felt calmer than before. But the inn he had hoped to find was nowhere in sight. The stream turned away between alder trees. The nearest chimney smoke was too far off. And though the sky still held light, It was now the light of evening, not day. Then Elwyn noticed something he had not seen before. A narrow path, almost hidden. It began just beyond the bridge, where elder bushes and fern fronds leaned together. It was not a proper lane, not a road marked on signposts or bordered by walls. It was simply a way through the green, a footpath so quiet and moss-covered that it seemed less made than remembered. Elwyn stood very still. The path rose gently toward a grove of trees. Something about it felt welcoming, not strange, not ominous, only quiet in a way that called to other quiet things. Elwyn adjusted his satchel once more, took up his walking stick, and stepped from the bridge onto the hidden path. And almost at once, the valley changed. Part 2, the grove of fern and evening light. The open air of the meadow gave way to the hush of trees. It was not a dark hush, nor a lonely one. Rather, it was the kind of stillness that belongs to places where many years have passed gently. A stillness of roots, moss, shade, and filtered light. A stillness that asks for slower footsteps. The earth beneath the path was springy with leaves and soft old needles. Ferns grew high on either side, their delicate fronds unfurling like green feathers. Hazel branches arched overhead. Wildflowers, pale and sleepy, nodded in the lower shadows. Every stone seemed thick with moss, every fallen branch softened by time. Elwyn walked carefully, breathing in the scent of damp bark, crushed fern, and cool evening soil. The sounds of the valley did not disappear entirely, but they grew distant, as if heard through layers of leaves. The stream still murmured somewhere below. A bird called now and then. But the grove had its own kind of silence, a deep and leafy silence made not of absence, but of listening. The path curved. A little farther on, it curved again. And with each turn, Elwyn felt more and more that he had entered a place not hidden by accident, but kept hidden by kindness. There were tiny lights in the undergrowth. At first, he thought they were fireflies, and perhaps some were, but some seemed steadier, warmer, almost golden. They glimmered near roots and vanished when looked at directly. Elwyn did not chase them. He simply noticed them and went on. Above him, the first stars had begun to appear between the branches. The sky, visible only in fragments now, was turning that deep, gentle blue that comes after sunset, when the day has fully let go of the earth. Elwyn felt no fear, only a growing sense of calm. It is a strange thing, perhaps, to say that one can feel safe in a place never seen before. But now and then, a road leads not merely onward, but inward, toward some quiet center where the heart, without quite knowing why, recognizes a familiar peace. So, it was for Elwyn. He passed a cluster of pale mushrooms at the foot of an ash tree. He stepped over a root, thick as a sleeping hound. He brushed his hand against ivy cool with evening dew. And then the path opened. Before him stood the oak. On Part 3, the old oak. It rose at the center of the grove like something older than memory. No other word suited it. The oak was immense, not merely large, but deeply ancient, shaped by many winters, many storms, many summers of leaf and birdsong and stillness. Its trunk was broad and furrowed, the bark silver-brown, and ridged in long folded lines. Its roots spread into the earth like the foundation of a hill. Its branches reached high, and higher than the other trees, and then outward in great sheltering arms, as though they had spent centuries learning how best to hold the sky. Elwyn stopped at once. Even tired as he was, even with night now gathering, he felt the need to stand quietly before the tree. The grove itself seemed to lean around it. The ferns grew thicker at its base. The moss was softer there. The air felt cooler and gentler. And beneath the vast turning of its roots, on half-hidden in green shadow and amber light, was something Elwyn could scarcely believe. A hollow. Not a rough hole in the earth, nor a dark opening beneath tangled wood, but a natural shelter shaped with such grace that it looked almost prepared. The roots curved outward and upward, forming a kind of chamber. Inside, the ground was thick with moss, dry leaves, and soft earth. There were no thorns, no stones sharp enough to trouble sleep. A faint warm glow seemed to rest within the hollow, not bright enough to dazzle, only enough to make it seem welcoming. Elwyn blinked, then blinked again. He stepped closer. The moss looked softer than many beds. The roots formed a ceiling strong and broad. There was room enough for him to sit, lie down, and draw his blanket around him in comfort. A few tiny white flowers grew from the edge of the earth beside the entrance. Above, leaves moved in slow conversation with the wind. Elwyn put a hand upon the bark of the oak. It was cool, deeply grooved, still, and yet, as his palm rested there, he felt something so quiet and steady that it almost took the shape of welcome. No words were spoken, no voice answered him from the tree, yet the feeling remained. This place, somehow, was meant for rest. Elwyn set down his satchel. "Well," he whispered, so softly that even the nearest leaf scarcely heard him, "I think I may have found where the road meant me to sleep." And with that, he entered the hollow beneath the old oak. Part 4. A bed of moss and root. Inside, the shelter was even warmer than it had seemed from without. The earth beneath the moss was dry and firm. The roots enclosed the space in a natural curve, protective but not confining. The glow, whatever its source, came softly from the bark and from the small spaces where root met earth, as if the tree itself kept a memory of daylight hidden within its oldest wood. Elwyn knelt first, then sat, and then, because he could not help it, he gave the kind of long, relieved sigh that only a very tired traveler knows. "This," he murmured, "is a very fine place indeed." He took off his shoes and flexed his toes in gratitude. He rolled out his blanket over the moss. He placed his satchel near his head. From it, he drew the last crust of bread, his little cup, and the packet of dried mint, though there was as yet no water to warm for tea. Still, merely arranging his things made the hollow feel more and more like a room made by roots, a room older than cottages, a room lined not with boards and plaster but with bark, leaf shadow, and the patience of centuries. He leaned back against one of the great roots. The smell inside the hollow was beautiful in its simplicity. Cool moss, old wood, leaf mold, earth, a faint sweetness like dried hay and distant apples. Outside, night deepened. The grove shifted into darker blues and greens. Somewhere above, an owl called once, a low, rounded sound. Crickets continued their thin and endless music. The stream below the hill went on, speaking over stones, in the same patient tone it must have used for years, beyond counting. Elwyn felt drowsiness draw closer, but just then he heard something else. Footsteps, not hurried, not heavy, only soft, regular footfalls moving along the hidden path. He sat up a little straighter and looked toward the entrance of the hollow. A lantern glow approached through the grove. Then a woman appeared. She wore a brown cloak, practical and well-made, fastened at the throat with a simple clasp. Her hair was braided neatly beneath a woolen hood. In one hand she held a lantern. In the other she carried a covered basket. She seemed entirely unsurprised to find Elwyn beneath the tree. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," Elwyn answered. "You found the oak." "I believe it found me," said Elwyn, which made the woman smile. "That happens," she said. She stepped nearer and set the lantern down on a flat stone. Its warm light joined the softer amber glow of the hollow. "I am Mara," she said. "I keep the inn in Brookbend village down by the stream." Elwyn rose as much as the root above allowed and bowed politely. "Elwyn Bramblefoot," he said, "traveler of moderate ambition and increasingly tired feet." Mara laughed very softly. "That is an honest introduction," she said. "And you look in need of supper." She lifted the cloth from the basket. The smell that rose into the hollow was so comforting that Elwyn nearly closed his eyes on the spot. Fresh bread, butter, a little broth in a flask, and, wrapped in linen, what looked very much like honey cake. "I thought," said Mara, "that if the oak had invited a guest tonight, the least we in the village could do was send a meal." Elwyn looked from the basket to Mara, then to the tree, and then back again. "That," he said, "is one of the finest customs I have ever heard of." And truly, it was. Part 5. The Kindly Innkeeper's Basket. Mara sat upon one of the roots near the entrance, while Elwyn, with many grateful words, accepted the meal. The bread was still faintly warm. The butter carried the taste of herbs. The broth was rich with onion, leek, and thyme. The honey cake was dense and fragrant, and with just enough spice to make it feel like autumn, even in a green season. Elwyn ate slowly, not only because he was polite, though he was, and not only because he wished to make such goodness last, though he did, but because the night itself seemed to ask for slowness. Nothing in the grove wished to be hurried. The lantern light glowed gold across the roots. The leaves above whispered in low, patient waves beyond the entrance of the hollow, and fireflies drifted among the ferns like bits of quiet starlight. Mara watched the night as Elwyn ate. At last he asked, "Do many travelers sleep here?" "Not many," she said, "only those who truly need rest." Elwyn glanced upward at the vast arch of roots and trunk. "And the village sends them baskets?" Mara nodded. "When we know they are here." "How do you know?" At that she smiled again, the way one smiles at old customs too familiar to explain plainly. "The valley has its ways," she said. "A shepherd sees a lantern where none was lit. A child dreams of the oak. A dog insists upon walking the hidden path and will not come back until someone follows. Once, years ago, my grandmother said the bell in the tower rang once in still air, though no one had touched the rope. Whenever such things happen, we look to the grove." Elwyn found this entirely reasonable, Mara went on. "The oak has stood longer than our houses, longer than the bridge, perhaps longer than the road itself. It has watched over shepherds, wanderers, woodcutters, children, lovers, widowers, tired mothers, old men with market carts, and one very sleepy fiddler who snored so deeply beneath its roots that he missed half the morning." Elwyn smiled into his cup. "It sounds," he said, "like a very noble tree." "It is," Mara said, "but also a practical one. It knows the worth of sleep." At this, Elwyn liked the oak more than ever. When he had finished the broth and the bread, Mara poured water from a small flask over the mint leaves into his cup. It was not hot, but cool and fragrant. The scent rose fresh and soft into the hollow. Elwyn drank. The mint tasted of gardens at dusk, stone wells, and quiet kitchen shelves, a perfect taste for the closing of day. They sat for a while without speaking. It was the sort of silence that feels companionable at once. No effort, no need to fill it. Only the lantern, the roots, the slow settling of the night, and the gentle understanding that all was well. At last, Mara stood. "The inn is called the Lantern at Brookbend," she said. "If you follow the stream in the morning, you will find us." "I believe I shall," said Elwyn. Mara picked up the empty cloths, but left the honey cake. "Then sleep well," she said. "The oak keeps good watch." And with that, she took up the lantern and departed the way she had come, her light moving gradually between the trunks until it became only a warm dot, then nothing at all. Elwyn watched until the grove returned fully to itself. Then he settled back into the hollow, and the old oak seemed to draw the whole night gently closer. Part 6. The first sleep beneath the tree. Elwyn folded his coat beneath his head and stretched out upon the blanket. The moss beneath him was soft and springy. The great root at his back curved like the side of a chair made for sleeping. The air was cool upon his face, but the earth below held a lingering warmth. He drew the blanket over himself. Above him, through small openings between roots and leaves, he could see pieces of the night sky, deep blue, then darker blue, then nearly black, with stars opening one by one like distant lanterns. He listened. From the leaves whispered overhead. The stream moved below the hill. An owl called again, farther now. Something small, perhaps a dormouse or hedgehog, rustled near the outer ferns and then grew still. Elwyn's breathing slowed. He was not yet asleep, but he had entered that gentle borderland where thought no longer moves in straight lines, the borderland where memory softens and drifts, where one remembers the curve of a teapot handle, the glow of a window at dusk, or the exact comfort of an old chair, the smell of soup in another room. He thought of home, not with homesickness exactly, but with tenderness. He thought of the round green door of his little house, of the polished brass knob, of the shelf where he kept 3 good bowls and one that was cracked but too beloved to throw away, of his garden path with thyme growing between the stones, of the teapot that always whistled just slightly off-key. He smiled. The old oak creaked once in the breeze, not loudly, not sharply, only the deep, slow sound of ancient wood settling into itself. And somehow that sound was comforting, too. Elwyn closed his eyes. The night seemed to deepen around him, not as darkness deepens in frightening places, but as blankets deepen over the body when one is being tucked safely in. The grove was holding him, the earth was holding him, and the roots above him felt less like wood and more like shelter itself. At last, with one soft breath that seemed to leave the whole of the day behind, Elwyn slipped into sleep. Part 7. Dreams of warm doors and moonlit paths. He dreamed, as gentle souls often do, of things both familiar and strange. He dreamed of walking through a village made entirely of lantern light and round windows. Each house stood beneath a grassy hill, and every door was painted a different shade of green: moss green, sage green, olive green, green with a touch of gold, where the lamplight rested upon it. He dreamed of an endless supper table beneath the branches of the oak, where no plate ever emptied and no teacup ever cooled. There were warm loaves of bread and blackberry jam, golden butter, soups rich with barley, and little cakes dusted with sugar so fine They shone like moonlit frost. He dreamed of a stone lane winding uphill beneath stars, where foxes walked politely beside him as though on evening errands of their own. He dreamed of windows glowing in distant hillsides, of songs half heard through hedges, of a bell ringing once over the valley and sending a ripple of peace through the sleeping fields. At one point in his dream, he stood again beneath the old oak, but now it was spring. The branches were heavy with young leaves, bright as emerald glass. The roots were ringed with daffodils, violets, and wild primrose. Children ran laughing through the grove while old dogs slept in the shade. And the oak, tall above them all, held the sunlight in green layers that moved like silk in the breeze. Then the dream became winter. Snow lay upon the branches. The valley was white and still. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight, quiet lines. And beneath the roots of the oak, the hollow glowed warmly, as though summer had never entirely left it. Elwyn, even in sleep, felt the meaning of these dreams without needing words. The oak had always been there, through spring garlands and autumn leaves, through summer songs and winter frost, through the passing years of small lives and long roads, a keeper of shelter, a patient witness, an old companion to all who needed rest. And so he slept more deeply still. Part 8. Midnight in the Grove. There came sometime in the middle of the night a moment when Elwyn half woke. It was not a full waking, only a floating rise from sleep, the kind in which one becomes dimly aware of one's blanket, the coolness of the air, and the distant sounds of the world before drifting down again. He opened his eyes just enough to see the moon. Its light came through the leaves in silver fragments, and it touched the moss. It turned the edges of roots pale and smooth. It made the little white flowers near the entrance glow, like stars fallen into earth. The grove was astonishingly calm. A faint mist had gathered low among the ferns. The stream below sounded softer than before. Even the crickets seemed to sing more quietly, as if careful not to disturb whatever peace the old tree kept within its roots. Elwyn felt no loneliness, and that is perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. For many places at midnight can feel empty, but the grove did not feel empty. It felt full of stillness, full of leaf shadow and moonlight, full of time, full of the gentle presence of living things at rest. He turned slightly, nestling deeper into the blanket. The root at his back was firm and reassuring. The moss beneath his shoulder gave way just enough. The scent of bark and cool earth rose around him. Then he heard something else, a very soft sound above. Not footsteps, not voices, only the faint movement of leaves shifting in the higher branches, though there was scarcely any wind. It sounded almost like the oak breathing, long in, long out. Or perhaps that was only Elwyn's own breathing, slow and heavy now, joined for a moment with the rhythm of the tree above him. He did not try to decide. He simply closed his eyes again, and sleep took him once more, deeper than before. Part 9. The story the valley remembered. Toward the later hours of the night, when dreams become more spacious and quiet, Elwyn dreamed again. And this time his dream was not only his own. It was as though the valley itself remembered something and allowed him to rest inside that memory for a while. He saw, dimly and gently, shepherds from long ago driving sheep through morning mist. He saw women carrying baskets of apples along an old lane. He saw children laying flower crowns at the foot of the oak and then running away, laughing before the petals had even settled. He saw a woodcutter, weary and soaked with rain, sleeping beneath the roots while his boots dried by some small, hidden warmth. He saw a widow in a black shawl who came one evening and sat beneath the tree, not to sleep at first, but to cry quietly where no one would see, and later, at last, to rest. He saw a young fiddler curled with his instrument beside him, dreaming of songs yet unwritten. He saw lovers sharing bread there at sunset. He saw an old man pausing with his donkey cart, touching the bark with his wrinkled hand before going on. None of them stayed forever. All returned to their roads, their cottages, their lives, but the oak remained. And that was the comfort in it. And there are things in the world that pass. Weather, seasons, footsteps, lamplight, songs, even the most tender evenings. And there are things that remain, not unchanged, perhaps, but faithful. A bridge, a bell tower, a hearth, a tree. The valley remembered, and because the valley remembered, Elwyn slept as though wrapped not only in blanket and moss, but in belonging. Part 10. Dawn at the roots. Morning came very slowly. First, the dark blue of the sky softened to gray. Then the gray thinned to pearl. Then one bird sang, only one. A small, clear note from somewhere above the grove. Then another bird answered, then another. Soon the air was full of the first delicate stitching of bird song, each call crossing the hush of dawn like thread through cloth. Elwyn opened his eyes. For a few moments he did not move. The world was pale and cool and new. Dew rested on every fern. The leaves above were touched with silver light. The mist low in the grove was beginning to lift, and the old oak, vast and still, seemed somehow brighter in the morning than it had by moonlight, as if daylight revealed not less mystery, but a gentler kind. Elwyn sat up slowly. He was rested, not only in body, though his legs felt lighter and his feet less sore, but deeper than that. The tiredness he had carried in some quiet part of himself for longer than one day's journey. That tiredness, too, seemed softened. He laid a hand upon the bark beside him. "Thank you," he said. The leaves overhead trembled in a passing breeze. Then, because hunger returns even after magical sleep, Elwyn ate the last of the honey cake and rose. He folded his blanket. He brushed moss from his sleeves. He laced his shoes. He stood once more within the shelter of the roots and looked out into the brightening grove. The hidden path was easier to see by morning. It ran away between dew-lit ferns down toward the sound of the stream. A perfect little path for a traveler newly rested. Elwyn stepped out from beneath the oak. At once he felt the coolness of dawn upon his face. It was the sweetest sort of morning, quiet, green, and full of promise, and the valley beyond the grove lay washed in pale gold. Mist rested in the hollows. The distant hills shone softly, as if light had been poured over them. He turned once, just once, to look back at the tree. It stood as before, silent, sheltering, ancient beyond asking. And though there was no sign, no carving, no words upon the bark, Elwyn knew with certainty that he would remember this place all his life. And then he took the hidden path and walked downhill toward Brookbend. Part 11. The Lantern at Brookbend. The path wound gently between alder trunks and over roots wet with dew. Soon Elwyn heard the stream again. Then he saw the little stone bridge, shining faintly in the morning light. Beyond it, the valley opened, and there, tucked beside a bend in the water, stood the village of Brookbend. It was a lovely village, not grand, not crowded. Only a handful of pale stone cottages with thatched roofs and curling chimney smoke, a bell tower, a mill wheel turning slowly by the stream, kitchen gardens behind low walls, wood piles neatly stacked, a cat sitting in a patch of sun with the wisdom of all village cats. Near the bridge stood the inn. Its sign showed a painted lantern above a blue ribbon of water. Its windows were small and bright. Its door stood open to the morning. Elwyn crossed the lane and stepped inside. At once he was greeted by warmth. The inn smelled of porridge, fresh bread, oak smoke, and polished wood. A fire still glowed low on the hearth, taking the chill from the room. Copper pans shone on hooks near the kitchen arch. A striped rug lay before the fire. The chairs were sturdy and old, their arms smoothed by years of elbows and sleeves. Mara looked up from the counter and smiled. "I thought the oak might send you down this morning." "It has done so in excellent condition," said Elwyn. "Then sit," said Mara. "Breakfast is ready." And so Elwyn sat. He was given porridge with cream and brown sugar, thick toast with butter, stewed apples, and tea strong enough to wake even the sleepiest corners of the mind. He ate by the window while the village stirred outside. A cart rattled past. A boy carried milk pails down the lane. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and was immediately hushed. Everything felt exactly as it should. After breakfast, Elwyn asked if the village had always kept watch over the oak. "As far back as anyone remembers," Mara said, "and likely longer. My grandmother said her grandmother told stories of it. We do not own the grove, we simply honor it." Elwyn nodded. This seemed, again, the proper arrangement. He stayed at the inn through the morning. He warmed his feet by the hearth. He mended a loose button on his coat. He listened to the stream through the open window and found, to his surprise, that he felt no desire at all to hurry on. So Mara, who understood such things, offered him a small room for the next night. Elwyn accepted at once, and thus his single night beneath the oak became the beginning of several quiet days in Brook Bend. Part 12. The Days of Rest. Those days passed like the turning of pages in a favorite book. In the mornings, Elwyn walked gentle lanes through the valley. He watched mist lift from the meadows. He followed the stream past willow roots and millstones. He sat on warm rocks while dragonflies hovered over the water. At noon, he took simple meals at the inn: soup with crusty bread, cheese and pickled onions, baked potatoes with herbs, a pear tart on the second day, barley stew on the third, tea each afternoon, always with something small and sweet beside it. In the evenings he returned to the grove, not always to sleep beneath the oak, for one does not wish to trouble a sacred kindness too often, but sometimes simply to sit nearby, hat in hand, and listen. The grove changed with every hour. In late afternoon it glowed green and gold. At dusk it deepened into blue shadow. At night it filled with crickets, moonlight, and the glimmer of hidden lights among the roots. In morning it smelled of dew and fern and waking birds. Elwyn grew fond of it all. He grew fond of Brook Bend, too, of the baker with flour always on her sleeves, of the miller who hummed low songs while turning grain, of the old woman who watered her herb garden at sunset and nodded gravely to all passers-by, of the village cat, who eventually permitted Elwyn to scratch behind one ear. He grew fond of the inn's little hearth and its low-beamed ceiling, of the way the fire sounded after rain, of Mara's habit of setting a fresh flower in a bottle on the window ledge each morning. Most of all, perhaps, he grew fond of doing very little. This is an underrated gift: to wake without alarm, to walk without destination, to eat without haste, to sit quietly while wind moves through leaves, to allow the nervous parts of the mind to loosen one by one, like knots coming free in warm water. By the fourth day, Elwyn felt as though he had slept not merely through a night, but through an old season of weariness. And when at last he knew the road would call him onward again, he felt ready to answer it. Part 13. The Farewell to the Oak. On the morning of his departure, Elwyn packed his satchel carefully, blanket folded, cup wrapped, mint leaves nearly gone, a small loaf from Mara tucked into the top, and in one side pocket a tiny jar of honey given by the baker for the road and for good dreams, she had said. Before leaving the village, Elwyn walked once more to the grove. The hidden path welcomed him as before. The ferns parted, the air cooled, the sounds of Brookbend softened behind him. Then the grove opened, and there stood the oak. A daylight moved through its leaves in green layers. A blackbird perched high on one branch and sang. The roots lay broad and still. The hollow beneath them was empty now, but not abandoned. It simply waited, as such places always do, with great patience and no impatience at all. Elwyn stepped close. He placed both hands on the bark. For a while he said nothing. Then, very quietly, he spoke. "You gave me rest," he said. "Well, more than I knew I needed." The leaves stirred overhead. "I cannot repay you," he continued, "but I can remember." That seemed enough. He stood there a little longer, breathing the scent of moss and bark and sunlight through leaves. Then he bowed, not because anyone had told him to, but because the moment seemed to ask for it. At last, he turned and walked back down the hidden path. He did not look back until he reached the little bridge, and then he glanced over his shoulder and saw, above the green rise of the grove, only the upper branches of the oak moving gently against the sky. It was a small farewell, a perfect one. Part 14. The Road Beyond Brookbend. Elwyn left the village by the eastern lane. The weather was fair. The hills beyond were bright with clover and buttercups. The road turned between hedges and small farms, and then climbed gradually toward a line of low blue ridges in the distance. His feet moved steadily. His satchel sat well upon his shoulder, and though he was once again a traveler on the open road, he no longer felt like one who had been wandering. The oak had done something to him, not magic in the loud sense, not enchantment of sparks and spells and shining airs, something quieter. It had reminded him of rest, of belonging, of how deeply the world can comfort those who move gently through it. As he walked, he carried that comfort with him, in the warmth of the loaf in his satchel, in the memory of mint on cool water, in the recollection of moonlight on roots and dawn in the grove, in the certainty that somewhere behind him, in a valley of streams and bells and old stone bridges, there stood a tree that kept watch over the weary. This thought accompanied him through all the roads that followed. Whenever a night was long, he remembered the hollow. Whenever an inn was noisy, he remembered the leaves. Whenever life seemed hurried and overfull, he remembered the patient rhythm of the oak and the way the roots had held the dark without fear. And little by little, the remembrance itself became a kind of shelter. Part 15. Many years later, years passed, as they always do. Seasons turned through one another. Springs of birdsong and rain, summers of gardens and long paths. autumns of apples and wood smoke, winters of frost on windows, and kettles humming over low fires, Elwyn returned to his own home eventually, and remained there a good while. He tended his garden. He kept his cups polished. He walked the market road on fair days, and read by the fire on wet ones. He became, in time, one of those hobbits who are known for making excellent tea and telling very slow, very pleasant stories that almost always include a pie. But he never forgot Brookbend, nor the grove, nor the oak. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would sit in his chair with a blanket over his knees and tell visitors, only the kindest visitors, and never the boastful sort, of a valley where an old tree kept a bed of moss beneath its roots for those who truly needed sleep. Some believed him at once, some smiled politely, some asked for directions. To these last, Elwyn only smiled and said, "You do not find such places by hurrying." And in truth, he believed that. For certain, shelters revealed themselves only to the gentle-hearted and the tired enough. On winter nights, he sometimes dreamed of the grove again. He dreamed of fireflies under ferns, of Mara's lantern moving through the trees, of the stream speaking below the hill, of moonlight in the roots, and always, in the dream, he felt the same thing he had felt on that first evening, that the world, though often busy and noisy and full of roads, still held hidden places of perfect rest. Part 16. Returning in the heart, Elwyn never did return to Brookbend in body, not because he did not wish to, but because life, gentle though it was, carried him along other paths, and there were neighbors to help, gardens to tend, little tasks to do, letters to answer, meals to share, seasons to keep. And yet he returned often in thought, sometimes while stirring soup, sometimes while watching rain from his window, sometimes while hearing a branch move above the roof at night. Then the memory would come softly, the hidden path, the grove, the roots, the moss, the moonlight, and with memory came peace. Over time, Elwyn understood something. One need not sleep beneath the old oak every night in order to be sheltered by it. Some places, once they have welcomed you deeply enough, go on living within you. A grove can become a silence inside the mind. A lantern can become a warmth in the chest. A good bed of moss can become a gentleness toward one's own tired thoughts. And so, whenever the world felt too sharp or hurried, Elwyn would close his eyes for a moment and imagine again that ancient root at his back, the smell of cool bark, the rustle of leaves above. Then his breathing would slow, his shoulders would soften, and somewhere in the inward hush that followed, the old oak would be there, waiting without hurry, watching without demand, keeping, as it always had, a kind and patient night. Part 17. The forest still watches. And perhaps even now, when the oak still stands there, in that green valley beyond the bridge, beyond Brookbend and its lantern windows, beyond the stream, the meadows, and the old stone walls with time in the cracks. Perhaps the grove still keeps its secret path. Perhaps fireflies still drift under the ferns at dusk. Perhaps Mara's grandchildren now bring baskets of bread and broth when the village dreams that the oak has welcomed a guest. Perhaps tonight there is another small traveler there, another tired soul with dusty shoes and a quiet heart, another wanderer who did not mean to be far from home by nightfall, another weary body lowering itself with gratitude onto moss and root. Perhaps the oak bends its leaves above them too. Perhaps the stream tells its old story in the dark. Perhaps the valley bell rings once in still air, and perhaps that traveler, like Elwyn long ago, is discovering that the deepest comfort is not always found in walls and doors, but sometimes in the patient shelter of living things, in old roots, old silence, old kindness. The forest still watches, the valley still remembers, and somewhere, beneath the old oak, sleep still waits like a gentle blessing. Part 18. Drifting down into rest. Now the story grows quieter. The road has ended for tonight. The bread has been shared. The lantern has dimmed. The leaves have settled into their midnight rhythm, and if you wish, you may imagine once more that little hollow beneath the roots. See the moss there, soft and deep, the curve of ancient wood above, the tiny white flowers near the entrance, the last silver of moonlight resting on the bark. Feel the cool air upon your face, the safe weight of the blanket, the stillness of the tree, the earth below, holding all things calmly. Elwyn is there, curled softly on his side, one hand tucked near his cheek, his satchel resting beside him, his breathing slow, his face peaceful. The owl has gone quiet now. The stream still speaks, but softly. The stars remain above the branches, patient and far away. And the old oak keeps watch. No hurry, no danger, no need for anything more. Only the gentle passing of night. Only leaves, roots, moss, and rest. Only the deep kindness of a place made for sleeping. So let the grove grow dimmer. Let the branches blur into dream. Let the path disappear behind ferns and evening mist. And if you are tired, let yourself rest too. Because somewhere in the oldest part of the forest, beneath bark and moonlight, beneath still leaves and silver air, the hollow remains warm. The old oak remains steady. The valley remains quiet. And sleep, soft and ancient and good, is waiting there. Very soft outro for narration. And so Elwyn slept beneath the old oak, safe, warm, and deeply at peace. And the roots held the earth, and the earth held the night, and the night held his dreams, and above him the leaves whispered slowly in the dark, as if the whole forest had agreed to keep silence for his rest. So now the valley grows still, the lanterns fade, the stream goes on in softness, the stars remain above the branches, and somewhere far beyond waking, beneath the shelter of ancient wood, the little hobbit sleeps on, quietly, safely, peacefully, and perhaps tonight you may sleep there too.